Morning and welcome to the 25th meeting in 2020 of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. This meeting will be conducted in hybrid format with some of our members and all of our witnesses participating remotely. The first item on the agenda is Glasgow Prestwick Airport, and the committee is today taking evidence on Glasgow Prestwick Airport, and I'd like to welcome the panel from the Scottish Government who are giving evidence remotely. First of all, I'd like to welcome Michael Matheson, the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Infrastructure and Connectivity, and Francis Pichitti, the Director of Aviation, Maritime, Freights and Canals from the Scottish Government. Are there any members that wish to declare an interest? No. Okay, so Cabinet Secretary, I think you have got a short opening statement of up to 3 minutes, Cabinet Secretary. No, you're muted. Just hold on. Hold on, sorry, Cabinet Secretary. We missed your opening words. I'm sure you'll want to repeat them.
Good morning, Convener. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Now we can.
At the beginning of the year, good progress was being made towards concluding the process to return Prestwick Airport to the private sector. The process we carried out attracted interest from credible investors with aviation experience and proposals for taking the business forward. Preferred bidder was selected and detailed discussions and negotiations continued towards finalising a deal. That process was paused at the request of the preferred bidder when the impact of COVID on the aviation sector globally began to materialise. Clearly, that global impact continues to be felt across the entire aviation industry, and the preferred bidder has advised that it is unable to make the commitments needed to retain preferred bidder status at this time. It has, however, asked to be consulted and given the opportunity to participate in any future sale process. While this is disappointing, it is completely understandable. All businesses in the aviation sector are having to take difficult decisions to respond to the collapse in demand for travel and to ensure that they are well placed to survive the winter period after a dreadful summer. The team at Prestwick are considering further options for the business in the light of this development, as well as ongoing challenges for the industry more generally. They remain confident that Prestwick has a role to play in the Scottish aviation sector, and there has recently been strong performance across its niche areas of the aviation market, which has been demonstrated over the course of the last year. The withdrawal by the preferred bidder means the Prestwick team can engage with other interested parties, something they were unable to do while the previous sale process was live. That engagement is now underway. The committee will be aware that Prestwick reported an underlying operating profit of £3 million for the year to the 31st of March 2020. Revenue increased by 46% to £36 million. The underlying principles of the airport's performance were based on the development of new revenue opportunities coupled with measures to control costs and operational efficiencies. Clearly, the global impact of COVID-19 will be a factor in financial performance this year, but we should welcome the significant progress that has been made to improve the performance of the business, something that is down to the significant efforts of the team at Prestwick and its board to promote Prestwick's strengths, flexibility and win new business in a very competitive environment. Convener, while the decision by the preferred bidder not to purchase the business at this stage is disappointing, it also presents an opportunity to re-engage with other interested parties and engage with new ones. In addition, the airport management team will continue to consider all potential business opportunities to maximise the use of the asset of the airport and build on the significant progress that has already been made.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Now, there are some questions that I know about, and I suspect there will be more. The first question, though, on this is from Mike Rumbles. Mike.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You said it was disappointing and understandable that the preferred bidder has pulled out, and I totally agree with that. It is disappointing, but with the COVID problems that all our aviation industry is facing is perfectly understandable. But you said that discussions are underway with other interested parties. Could you let us know, at least, I'm not asking who they are, but I'd like to know whether that is another interested party or are there several other interested parties?
Cabinet Secretary.
Good morning, Mr Trumbull. It's more than one interested party.
Thank you for that. If this does proceed to a sale, then I would imagine that we're not getting to a sale until we're all out of this COVID-19 crisis and some long way away, I think still. But have you any idea when eventually that sale takes place, will the Scottish taxpayer get their money back? And also, could you tell me to date how much of Scotland's taxpayers' money is actually invested in Prestwick?
So I can't give you a timescale for the very reasons that you made reference to in your earlier comments, and that is the uncertainty that's been caused in the aviation because of COVID-19, which obviously had an impact on the sales process that Prestwick were undertaking with the initial preferred bidder. But it would be fair to say that there has been, as I mentioned, more than one interested party who've now been in touch with Prestwick to express an interest in the airport. In terms of the timescale for that, much of that is dependent upon where the discussions go, which have been taken forward at the present moment, and the intentions of those who are now engaged with Prestwick. Part of that, of course, will be dependent upon their existing business arrangements, but they clearly have indicated a level of interest that Prestwick are now pursuing with them. In terms of the overall costs of the loans which have been made available to Prestwick, the member will be aware that the loans which have been made available to Prestwick are taken forward on a commercial basis, given that it operates at arm's length to the Scottish Government. And the loans which have been provided to date amount to £43.4 million. In relation to the return on taxpayers' money, the member will recognise that Prestwick is a significant employer within the Ayrshire economy, not just directly with around 300 jobs at the site itself, but also with many of the aerospace businesses that are clustered around Prestwick that are dependent upon the airport, which is in excess of over 1,000 jobs. So I think it's important to recognise is that the investment which has been made by the Scottish Government in Prestwick not only helps to sustain the airport as an aviation facility and employment directly at the airport, it also helps to sustain what is a very important aerospace sector within the Scottish economy around Prestwick Airport. And any negotiation with a purchaser of it will be dependent upon those negotiations at that given time.
Thank you. Just before we go on, I'm just going to make this observation. I've now got 8 people who want to ask questions. We cannot have questions and answers taking so long. A 3.5-minute answer means that we'll be well over lunch before we get to the end of all of this session. Remind members, please, and Cabinet Secretary, keep the questions and answers short. Sorry, Mike.
Just a final one. The Cabinet Secretary has just outlined what a valuable asset it is, and it must be worth at least £43.4 million. I hope he keeps that in mind when the sale eventually goes through.
That looked like an observation rather than a question. So we'll move on to the next question. The next question, which is from Colin. Colin, followed then by Richard Lyle. So, Colin.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. As you said, the most recent annual accounts for Prestwick showed a profit of £3 million. Now, that profit didn't come from passengers significantly, because that is obviously still a loss-making area. It came from other areas. So could you comment on what's the government's understanding of the current position of the airport? Is it currently making a profit in this financial year?
Cabinet Secretary.
I can't give you that up-to-date information at the present time. Obviously, the business by the downturn in the aviation sector. The business is still operating to try and meet some of these challenges, but given that there is still a significant way to go in this financial year, I can't tell you exactly where they will be at the end of this financial year, but I would anticipate it having an impact on the business, and we'll have a clearer picture of that as we move towards the end of the financial year.
On the issue of the loans themselves, obviously, because the company did make a profit, are they in a position to start paying back some of those loans?
No, the commercial loans and the way in which we're operating with them at the present time is that we're trying to help to support the business to make sure that it's able to sustain itself in a sustainable way going forward. Although they made a profit in the previous financial year, they are likely to have to use some of that going forward into this financial year, given the downturn in the aviation sector. So they haven't started to repay those loans at the present time.
When the sale was first announced, I made the point that I believe it was important that any deal included the repayment of those loans. Will you give an assurance that you will not take a cut price deal and write off those loans simply to wash your hands of the airport, and if need be, continue to run the airport under public ownership?
Well, what I won't do is that I won't start to open up the approach it will take to the sale of the airport if it does proceed. You can be absolutely assured that we will take an approach which is in the best interest of taxpayers in Scotland and also for the workforce at Prestwick Airport and its importance to the Ayrshire economy. And clearly we will work to make sure that we get the best return for taxpayers if any sale proceeds.
Thanks, Colin. Richard Lyle, followed by John Finney. Richard.
Morning, Cabinet Secretary. Unlike others, I've always supported Prestwick and said it's the jewel in Scotland's crown, and I think we should help it as much as possible. And it's good to see the turnaround, mainly due to freight and fuel sales. Very little passengers, so I don't think there'll be much COVID-19 effect because of no passengers. Cabinet Secretary, if I remember, no budget funding was allocated to Glasgow Prestwick in the last budget round. How will this affect Glasgow Prestwick finances due to COVID-19? And if they do need further support, which I would support, will you give it?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, look, we're in a position where, at the present moment, the airport don't require direct financial support from us at the present time. But I'm conscious, just like the rest of the aviation sector, that they're going through extreme challenges. Although passenger services have been impacted, the wider aviation industry has been impacted, including within freight and other forms of maintenance, because a big part of what Prestwick Airport also provides is an overhaul maintenance facility, which sees aircraft coming in for overhaul, and we saw a significant downturn in that sector as well. But the member can be absolutely assured we remain committed to Prestwick Airport. It's, as I've mentioned now, a critical part of the Ayrshire economy. We're not prepared to just allow the airport to simply close, given the very significant impact that would have on those who are employed directly and indirectly at Prestwick, and we remain committed to supporting it going forward.
And I support you. Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary.
Another statement, therefore. So we go to John Finney, followed by Maureen Watt. John.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, the Scottish Government already owns airports. Why would it seek to dispose of one that attracts the interests of credible investors? Why would it not retain it in its portfolio?
From the point when we purchased Prestwick, their intention was for it to return to the private sector. Our intervention was to help to sustain the airport, given its importance to the aerospace cluster within the Ayrshire economy. If you look at the portfolio of airports which the Scottish Government owns, they are largely to help to support island and regional connectivity in Scotland, which Prestwick does not form part of that type of role. And it's for that reason that we believe that Prestwick would be best served as being back in the private sector.
John.
Thank you, Convener. Well, I don't accept that position. I think if there's money to be made, it should be taken by the public sector. Cabinet Secretary, would you rule out the sale of that facility to the military and rule out further military use of that location, please?
Yeah, we've no plans to sell the airport to the military.
John.
And further use of the facility by the military, Cabinet Secretary?
Well, you'll be aware that Prestwick Airport has provided refuelling stops for the military since the 1930s, and it continues to do so. That will continue to be a part of the niche market that Prestwick Airport serves going forward. So it's something which has been doing for a very significant period of time, and I don't see that changing going forward.
Okay, thank you. I take that as a no. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, John. Maureen Watt, followed by Peter Chapman. So the Deputy Convener, Maureen. Good morning.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You mentioned in your opening statement new operational opportunities. I wonder if you could expand on that. And we have talked before about freight and how air freight is very much more expensive than other forms of freight movement. But given Brexit looming, do you think Prestwick Airport is in a position to readily and quickly take more freight if that in fact becomes necessary due to blockages at the channel ports?
So the airport management team are looking to expand some of the niche markets that they're already in. So, for example, as you mentioned in freight, there's clearly been a recovery in freight over the last couple of months, which they want to try and help to capitalise on if they can. So that's an area where they want to continue to see growth. There is certainly capacity at Prestwick Airport for an expansion of freight demand if that was necessary. So due to some of the concerns I know around the potential disruption it could cause because of the short straits as part of Brexit, there has been some interest and consideration given to whether additional freight provision at Prestwick could help to act as a bypass to some of the delays that could be experienced at the short straits at Dover. That was factored into our own contingency planning previously, and it would be part of our planning going forward in dealing with any disruption at the Dover Straits. However, these things to a large extent would have to operate on a commercial basis, and you correctly point out that freight is significantly more expensive than road or rail haulage. But it certainly has greater capacity there if there was an increasing level of demand for freight at Prestwick.
Thank you.
Perfect, Maureen. Thank you. Peter Chapman, you're next. So Peter Chapman, followed by me, unless there's anyone else on the committee that wants to ask questions. So Peter.
Thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned the 300 jobs at the Prestwick Airport. Unfortunately, we know that the privately owned aviation industry is shedding jobs at a very rapid rate just now. Is this now happening at Prestwick? And if not, why not? Because given that the taxpayer will eventually pick up the tab for any losses going forward.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm not sure if that was a demand for us to have folk laid off at Prestwick, because if it is, it's not the approach we want to try and take. There have been approaches taken by the management team previously at Prestwick to try to help to generate greater efficiencies in the operation of the site, which involved a voluntary redundancy programme. But there is clearly they're experiencing the same types of pressures that other businesses are, and they're trying to manage that as best they can. But I certainly don't think we should get ourselves into a situation where we're demanding that assets such as Prestwick are looking to start laying off staff unnecessarily, and that's certainly not the approach which the management team at Prestwick are taking.
Peter.
You know, the aviation industry across the world are laying off staff, and I just wonder, you know, I unfortunate as it may be, I'm not saying we'll lay off staff unnecessarily, but I think that if it is necessary, will that step be taken? That's what I'm asking. That you have to reflect what the marketplace does, and Prestwick's no different in that respect, I would argue.
Well, the management team there are trying to manage the business effectively as they can, and they're also trying to maximise areas where they can grow the business or sustain the business, and that's a primary focus there. But they recognise that they have financial challenges going forward, given the downturn in the sector, and are working hard to try and help to address those. But I think equally we should also try to help to support the business as best we can, given the critical role that it has to the Ayrshire economy. But you will be aware that there have already been some of the businesses that are associated with Prestwick that have had to lay off staff as a result of the downturn in the aerospace industry, not just in aviation, but the aerospace industry as well. So there have been some jobs which have gone in businesses which are associated with the airport, which is reflective of the downturn in the sector overall.
Peter, do you have any further questions? Because if you don't...
No, that's fine.
Okay, so I'm actually going to change the order because Emma Harper would like to ask a question next. So, Emma, over to you.
Thanks, Convener. My question's actually been answered by the Cabinet Secretary, so I do not need to ask it now.
Oh, perfect. So we can go back to the original order unless there's any other questions from committee members. So I've got a couple of questions for you, if I may, Cabinet Secretary. I think that in the past, annually, when the airport has been struggling to make headway it wants to in the market, it's had to borrow about £7 million a year to keep running. Is that the sort of figure that you're anticipating it might require this year?
I can't give you a figure of that nature at this present time. As it stands at the present moment, the business is operating within its own financial provisions rather than having to draw down any financial support from the Scottish Government.
Indeed, you'd expect that with a £3 million profit and only being halfway through the year, but maybe towards the end of the year with things getting tougher. Could you just clarify the £3 million profit made last year? How much of that came from fuel trading? Because in the past we've seen the majority of profit coming from fuel trading.
You asked me something similar when I appeared at the committee just, I think, last month.
So I was sure you were going to have the answer, Cabinet Secretary.
Pardon?
I was sure you were therefore going to have the answer today.
And I'm conscious that Prestwick Airport have written to the committee on the matter, setting out the level of information that they can provide on that.
Okay, so I'll take it that you don't have the answer, therefore.
You did get the response from Prestwick Airport, which I asked them to send to you.
I did, and I'm asking you the question, Cabinet Secretary. You would have had that response as well, but let's not go down that if we don't want to. I would ask for two further questions. First of all, could you confirm that the Prestwick Airport are continuing to pay interest on the loans that the government had given them on the basis that it's a commercial loans?
So, just come back to your previous question, Convener. I have a copy of the letter here, where the business sets out the level of sales in relation to fuel. So it says that whilst passengers' numbers have reduced again, this has more than been made up for non-scheduled and other aviation activities in the group, and the business has benefited from an increased sales volume of 85% year on year of 36 million litres, and cargo volumes remain strong at 14,000 tonnes. That's a level of information that can be provided in terms of the commercial sensitivity about the overall business balance within the company's accounts, but that's information that was provided to the committee in a letter to the committee on the 11th of September.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and I suppose I will wait for the accounts to be published where the fuel trading figure is actually declared in the accounts, so I'm happy to do that at this stage. So go back to the interest question, if I may, please. Is Prestwick Airport paying interest on the loans that the Scottish Government have made them?
I'll ask, if you don't mind, I'll ask Francis Passetti to address that directly.
Thank you. Francis.
Good morning, Convener. Yes, interest does continue to accrue on the loans that have been made available to the airport. The repayment of interest is deferred alongside the principal sum.
So the interest is just added to the original sum of the loan?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah. Mike, I'll let you come in, and then I've got one further question, if I may.
Just on that very point, I did ask how much is owed. So the 43.4 million, is that including the deferred interest or excluding it?
I would double check that. I don't want to give any information which is inaccurate, but my understanding is the 43.4 represents the entire sum that's due by the airport, but I would double check that.
Okay. Richard, you wanted to come in before I have a final question.
Cabinet Secretary, you appalled at the negativity of some members in regard to the support that we're given to an excellent airport in an area that needs employment. What is your view on the negativity of some of the questions you're getting?
Cabinet Secretary, I, of course, will allow you that, and then I'm going to come back at the end. So, Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm very conscious that some people didn't support our intervention or didn't welcome our intervention in Prestwick at the time, back in 2013. And some people remain of the view that they remain sceptical of our intervention at Prestwick. I do find it rather surprising, given the demands that were faced from all the political parties to take action to help to support the aviation sector. Here is an aviation facility which we've been supporting over the course of almost the last 7 years that sustains, as I say, over 1,000 jobs in the Ayrshire economy, in the aerospace industry, and there is clearly a desire for some to make some political hay out of this. But look, the reality is that as a government, we're very much committed to Prestwick, and we'll continue to do the right thing by it, despite some of the negativity that's been expressed around our actions.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And if those comments were directed at me, which I suspect they were, I will make the observation that it is absolutely right that we question the whole issue of finances. Now, my final question, Cabinet Secretary, if I may, to you, is that I absolutely understand the importance of Prestwick Airport. I understand all the relevant businesses around the airport, and I was very pleased to see the interaction between those businesses and Prestwick Airport when the committee visited that. Could you confirm to me that when you are negotiating the sale of Prestwick Airport, it is to sell Prestwick Airport with the long-term ambition of keeping it as an airport? Because there are some rumours flying around that it was being sold off to developers for non-airport type trade, i.e. housing and business development. And I'd just like you to understand, was that what you were trying to do when you were negotiating the sale of the airport, Cabinet Secretary?
First of all, my comments were directed at you. They were general comments in response to Mr. Lyle's question. But I am surprised at your question. The reason being is that you will recall that there was a sales criteria that was published around any business that was interested in purchasing the site. And that criteria makes very clear about it remaining as the aviation facility.
Okay, perfect. That's what I wanted to ascertain, and it's just that without knowledge of who was bidding for the airport, we don't know what their ultimate objectives are. people's businesses can change direction. Cabinet Secretary, I think that's all the questions we've got on Prestwick Airport. And we are going to move straight on to the second item of our agenda, which is financial scrutiny of COVID-19 impact. We're going to take evidence with a focus on that particular subject, and we'll hear today from the Scottish Government from two panels. The first panel will focus on transport and connectivity. I would just like to ask if there are any members who want to declare any interest regarding transport or connectivity. Stuart Stevenson, I suspect you may have one you want to declare. I'm sorry if I've miscalled you. Stuart.
No, you're correct, Convener. It's simply to say that my registered interest shows I'm the Honorary Vice President, Rail Future UK, and the Honorary President of the Scottish Association for Public Transport. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I don't see any other members who wish to declare an interest. So I'm going to welcome from the panel Michael Matheson, the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Infrastructure and Connectivity. Staying in your seat and moving straight onto this panel, as it were, Cabinet Secretary. Laura Murdoch, the Director of Bus Accessibility and Active Travel. Alison Irvin, the Director of Transport Strategy and Analysis. And Terry Holmes, the Director of Finance. Cabinet Secretary, I believe that you want to make a short opening statement of up to 3 minutes. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. I informed the committee on the 2nd of September in order to keep public transport services running while capacity is reduced due to physical distancing requirements. We have committed £487 million in additional financial support for public transport services in Scotland. At this point, the largest bus operators are running on average almost 95% of normal services, with ScotRail running at 91% of normal service levels. Without this additional funding, service levels would have been reduced significantly across all modes of public transport, as well as the economic and social impacts that this would have had presented a material public health risk given physical distancing requirements. We remain engaged with operators to ensure that existing and future financial support measures are in place as we move through this pandemic. Our ongoing response to the COVID pandemic, the Transport Transition Plan, was launched on the 26th of May and continues to evolve as measures to reduce COVID transmission remain fluid. We continue to monitor travel demand and work closely with public transport operators, regional transport partnerships and local authorities in Glasgow and Edinburgh City regions to ensure our respective plans are aligned. Local authorities to continue to roll out Spaces for People projects for which they are responsible. We have repurposed almost £39 million of active travel funding this financial year to enable them to put in place the temporary measures such as pop-up cycle lanes and widening walkways that are needed to allow people to physically distance while walking, wheeling and cycling. Building on the increase in cycling levels we saw during and beyond lockdown, the Scottish Cycle Repair Scheme launched on the 3rd of August, offering £50 towards bike repairs. A total of 30,000 repairs are available on the scheme, totalling £1.5 million of investment. On the 16th of July, we launched the £10 million Bus Priority Rapid Deployment Fund, which is supporting local authorities working in partnership with bus operators to implement temporary bus priority measures. These measures tackle the impact of congestion on bus services, making journeys faster and more reliable as we progress through the recovery from the pandemic. Given the continued prevalence of the virus, the measures outlined above remain critical to ensuring we have a functional public transport system in Scotland. There is a high degree of uncertainty in future travel demands, and we are instigating a wide programme of analysis and policy development to ensure that public transport in Scotland continues to serve the well-being of the people of Scotland and is responsive and flexible to future demand. Finally, our travel demand messaging with associated marketing and outreach continues to ensure those who need to travel can do so safely. And I'll close at that point. Convener, I'm happy to answer any questions from committee members.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. And there are a lot of questions, as you would expect. The first questions are going to come from John Finney. So, John, off you go.
Thank you, Convener. Morning again, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, with regard to the additional funding you mentioned there that's required to support the continued operation of public transport, I think you mentioned the figure of 487 million. There may indeed be other monies on top of that. Where's that money coming from? And can you outline what impact that's having on the ability of Transport Scotland to perhaps deliver on other projects and services, please?
The funding, Mr Finney, is coming from a combination of our existing funding and also some of the Barnett consequentials which we've received from the UK government. So, for example, elements of the funding which we are providing to the bus sector are in part the funding which we would have used in this financial year to meet the costs of concessionary travel, which has provided some of the initial funding to support the sector. Alongside the Barnett consequentials which we've received from the UK government for support for the bus industry, we've been able to provide the additional funding which has allowed services to be ramped up to, in some cases, 95% plus from bus operators. That's broadly the same across the rail side and in other areas of public transport. So it's a combination of our existing funding commitments and also the additional Barnett consequentials for public transport provision.
John.
Oh, okay, thank you very much indeed for that. I wonder, can you let the committee know how Transport Scotland ensures that funding delivers services that people actually need? We know there's well-documented changes in travel patterns caused by increased home working, for instance, and restriction in social activities. Are you able to also see if there's any liaison with local authorities with regard to that? Because they play a key role in the delivery of public transport as well. I think of constituents in Western Ross who feel more isolated than ever as a result of this. How is ensured that public money is properly targeted, please?
Okay, before I bring in Laura Murdoch, who can say a bit more about how services are provided, we do have a criterion contract in place that requires those, for example, on the bus side to make sure that they are providing up to 100% of their previous mileage, or kilometres, as they class it, to pre-COVID levels. And to make sure that those services are reflective of local demand and where there is a level for an increasing level of demand on services, working in partnership with local authorities and RTPs, that they provide additional service provision in these areas where they can do so. So there is a requirement for bus operators to be engaging at a local level with local authorities and local regional transport plan partnerships to look at how they deliver these services and they're responsive to local demand. But I'll ask Laura to say a little more about the nature of that engagement and the process that is used to address these issues.
Laura.
Good morning. Yes, good. Thank you, Convener. Yes, as the Cabinet Secretary was saying, there are clear conditions attached to the funding that we are giving to bus operators, and those include consulting and cooperating with local transport authorities because, as you quite rightly say, they've got a key role in public transport provision. The patterns of demand that we are seeing are very different from prior to the pandemic, and we are asking bus operators and local transport authorities to be responsive to that change in demand in terms of where that capacity is put. And that is under constant review. So as different restrictions come into play or are eased, that changes travel patterns, and therefore the provision is under constant review. But it is a clear condition of funding that not only do the bus operators cooperate with the local transport authorities, but respond positively to reasonable requests made by them. And of course, local transport authorities also provide supported services on top of the commercial services that bus operators provide.
John Finney.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener. I'll conclude there. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, John. So the next questions will come from Richard Lyle. Richard.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, what impact will the end of the furlough scheme have on the provision of public transport services, including school transport and other services provided by coach operators? Will Transport Scotland do anything to mitigate any of these impacts?
Convener, the end of the furlough scheme is likely to have a significant impact on public transport. We may see an increasing level of demand on public transport that could have a direct impact on public transport providers. There will be those who are transport providers that have staff that are furloughed at the present moment that may be impacted. That could include those who are transport operators for local authorities in providing school transport or in providing other transport provisions at a local level that could be impacted by the end of the furlough scheme. So I would expect that in terms of the public transport side that it could have an impact if we see an increasing level of individuals returning to their workplace and driving an increasing level of demand. In terms of service provision, including whether it be coach operators that Mr Eller made reference to that provide dedicated school transport services, they may be impacted if they don't have all of their staff that have returned. But if the staff have already returned, given that the schools are back, then in effect they're already these are staff that will no longer be on furlough. But it's hard to gauge exactly what impact it would have on those businesses that presently have staff furloughed, because we don't have the details of the numbers of businesses in the transport sector that still have staff furloughed. But I would, as I say, I think the principal aspect may be we see an increasing level of potentially increasing level of demand for public transport.
Cabinet Secretary, thanks for that. You're going to face maybe quite a number of questions regarding budgets and how much money is getting spent on this. But given finite budgets and financial demands of COVID-19, are there any areas of transport investment that the Scottish Government may have to redeploy to meet any shortfall? You spoke about basically some of the finances has been redeployed. Can you tell us what ones have?
Yeah, for example, we've had to what we've done with, for example, Spaces for People is an example of trying to be flexible with the funding which we provide for active travel. That would normally be for permanent active travel infrastructure, but local authorities and partners were unable to take that forward during the course of the pandemic. So we created the Spaces for People programme, which allows temporary infrastructure to be put in place and to be able to do that in a quick process to help to support people physically distancing. So that's a practical example of the measures which we have taken. We've also had to provide some financial support to, for example, some elements of the aviation industry, which has resulted in us having to use some of the funding which we would normally use to in just wider transport provision to help to provide them with some financial assistance. So, for example, during the course of the lockdown earlier in the year, we were providing a skeleton air service to maintain critical air connectivity to our island communities. And that's not something that we would normally be paying for, but we've had to provide financial resource in order to achieve that. But we've tried to absorb that in our wider budget rather than actually being taken from any particular project and that project not being able to progress. I say in terms of our wider plans, we aren't planning to significantly change our spending commitments. So I wouldn't say to you that we are cancelling anything. There may be some elements that could potentially take a bit longer to take forward because of a combination of not just the financial pressures, but also because of the pressures on staff and their ability to progress issues in the same way in which they would. So there is no intention for us to stop doing a lot of the work that we were taking for prior to the pandemic, and clearly some of the lessons that we've learned during the course of the pandemic will probably inform some of the actions that we take forward in the future, given the changing nature of how people are making use of public transport, and we'll have to look at how that is sustained going forward.
So basically acting responsibly and looking to veer money where you have to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. The next questions come from Stuart Stevenson. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. I've two questions on different subjects for you, Cabinet Secretary. The first of which relates to people who've used public transport via season tickets on buses and railways. Clearly, travel patterns have significantly changed, and season ticket holders don't have a ready replacement. Now, I expect part of your answer in relation to railways might point us at the Flexi Pass, which you can buy a pack of 10 tickets for a month to use when you want, which gives you a 10% discount. But I just draw your attention to people who are rail card holders, which generally gives you a third off, cannot use their rail cards to buy Flexi passes at a discount. So actually, the Flexi passes are more expensive in a particular position where they could buy with the rail card season tickets, but Flexi passes don't help them, and there's quite a substantial number of people. Now that's a sort of omnibus question on the general subject, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, bearing in mind I'm trying to tease out relation to buses and trains.
Convener, the member, Mr Stevenson makes a good point around the changing patterns of people's behaviour in public transport and the way in which they're using public transport that has created a significant financial challenge for the sector in itself, which is why we're providing financial support. What is uncertain at the present time is what demand and usage on public transport will look like post-COVID-19. And there's a lot of uncertainty around that. Will we get back up to the 100% demand that we had post-COVID-19, pre-COVID-19? Will we get back up to that in the post-COVID-19 environment? So there's a lot of uncertainty. What we are doing, for example, on the rail side, is that we're already working with ScotRail to review the existing ticket products and ticket channels which they have at the present moment, including elements such as a Flexi Pass. So could the Flexi Pass, for example, rather than being for a month, could we extend the time frame over which they could potentially be used, given the way in which, for example, someone who may have travelled several times a week using Flexi Passes may, because of the change in their work pattern, now actually travelling less, and therefore they need less of the tickets in the course of a month. Therefore, by extending the time that the product can be used for, could help to assist them in being able to make use of it. So we're presently undertaking a piece of work with ScotRail to look at these very issues. The other part that I'm conscious of is that we're also exploring and considering other measures that we could take in order to help to incentivise people back onto public transport once we get through this pandemic as well. And I know that ScotRail and also bus operators are also considering this. Other elements of their products that they could change in order to make them more flexible, to reflect changing patterns, and also other measures that we could look to take that can help to incentivise people to make use of public transport in the future once we're in a space where we no longer have physical distancing on public transport.
Stuart.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That's useful, but I think it boils down to we'll hear more later. In the meantime, I think the workers, often on comparatively modest earnings, who are having to continue to travel to work because of the nature of the jobs that they have. Is there anything you can do for them, perhaps in the shorter term, ahead of perhaps the more general systematic look that you appear to have just described to me?
I think it's a fair point that Mr Stevenson raises. I'm more than happy to take that away and to look to see if there's anything more we can do, other than to give them an assurance that we are already engaged with the sector to look at what further measures we could introduce to try and make products more flexible. But I'm certainly more than happy to take away the suggestion that Mr Stevenson has made.
Stuart.
Right. Thank you. My next question is on a different subject. The ScotRail and Caledonian Sleeper franchises, which expire in the not too distant future. Have you had any discussions or news from the UK government in relation to emergency recovery measures agreements, which appear to be coming to replace that, and in particular in relation to the Williams Review, which might, depending on what the UK government decides to do, abolish franchises altogether? And I'm asking that in relation to that we have no legislative competence in this space at Holyrood. We only have the administrative devolution that enables us to award and manage franchises. So therefore, the future of the franchise is not just the calendar bringing it to an end, but probably wide change in the whole approach. And it's important that we understand that UK and Scottish administrations, the Welsh as well for that matter, should be working closely, and I'd be interested to hear on that at relatively brief length. I don't think to make a meal of it, Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, briefly, Convener, on those points, have we heard from the UK government on the outcomes from the Williams Review? The answer is no. Have been provided with any details around what they plan to take from the Williams Review at the present time. I've been provided with no details of that. We know that the UK government, and I'm conscious that the Secretary of State for Transport has said that he believes that the pandemic has demonstrated that that franchising is dead, and that they are moving to these emergency agreements, emergency recovery measure, or what they call emergency recovery measure agreements, going forward with their franchises. But we have not been provided with any clear line of sight as to what's to be put in place to replace franchising, and what level of competence we will have on being able to take an alternative route at the present time. It would appear that the DfT's preferred route, it looks as though it's going towards direct awards of rail services. But it's unclear whether that's an interim approach to further more fundamental reform, because we don't know what the outcome from the Williams Review has been to date.
Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. That's it.
Thank you. I actually have a couple of supplementaries on this, if I may. First of all, Cabinet Secretary, I think you certainly told me, and I think you told the committee, that the first 6 months of the ERM would cost the Scottish Government £250 million. So on the basis of that, is it right to assume that the entire cost for running ScotRail for the year will be around £500 million?
At the present moment, we are at the figure overall is around. It has been a combination of the first EMA and the second EMA, which is an additional. You're right, an additional £100 million. We are still in a position where we are looking to negotiate what the agreement will be from January through to going forward. So. What I can't say is confirm the exact figure, because we are still planning for that, but it's likely to be of a similar quantum as it has been over the course of the last 7 months and going forward towards the end of this year.
Okay, so we're talking roughly on the basis of what you said, around £500 million, around.
We're roughly in that case.
Okay, so
yes.
That's slightly less than we are led to believe that it cost to run the operation during the franchise. Is that a correct assessment as well?
I couldn't say for to be exact on that. So, but I would, I'm more than happy to check and come back to you on that, convener.
Okay, it would be helpful because it is my understanding that the costs of running the franchise, you could roughly split it down a third, i.e. a third of the costs relate to staff, a third of the costs relate to the renting of the rolling stock, and a third of the costs relate to the infrastructure, none of which can really be cut, i.e. none of the staff have been furloughed, none of the rolling stock can be returned, and the infrastructure projects are just as important now as they were before. So I am confused how those figures stack up, i.e. what it cost before if the costs are roughly the same now, but the overall cost appears to be less. I mean, if you could clarify that in a letter to the committee, Cabinet Secretary, it would be extremely helpful for me and perhaps for others to understand.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, convener.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. So therefore, we'll move on to the next question. Oh, sorry, I forgot in my rush to move forward that Colin actually had a question on this subject as well. So I should have brought you in first, Colin. I apologise, but Colin.
Thank you, Convener. Just a couple of questions, Cabinet Secretary. I'm curious as to why the new EMA runs only until January. And in terms of the short term, or short to medium term, we know that passenger numbers won't return to pre-COVID levels for some time. What is your short to medium term vision for the sector? I mean, do you anticipate simply continuing to pay additional subsidies until the ScotRail franchise comes to an end in March 2022 and the Circle one runs until 2030? Do you anticipate both of them continuing to run to the end of those times?
So, convener, in relation to the first point that's been made, the reason it runs till January is because we had no indication from the UK government on Barnett consequentials to help to support rail services going forward at the time when we had to make the decision to extend it. And as a result of having a lack of financial information from the UK government, we made it for a shorter period of time until we had clarity on that matter. So that was the principal reason for the reason it only ran until January. You'll be aware that we had to put that in place. We put it in place slightly ahead of the UK government, but in doing so, we didn't have the financial information that we required from them to be able to do it for a longer period of time. In relation to our short to medium term vision, so we are, you'll be aware that we're ending the Abellio contract in March 2022. Our intention is to see that process through going forward. The issues about whether franchises continue in the future, we've had from the DfT or we've had from the Secretary of State for Transport that they see franchises as being at an end. What's unclear to us is what's the alternative options there at the present moment. And that could have an impact on the long term or the medium term, what choices we have for running rail services. So including the sleeper service, depending on whether franchises that are presently in place are able to continue or not. So until I've got clarity around what we can do with rail services and what powers we'll have in shaping rail services, our present position is that we continue with what we have in place at the present moment, and in particular with the Abellio ScotRail franchise until March 2022. What we'll be able to do thereafter, I don't know at the present time due to a lack of clarity. In terms of the Caledonian Sleeper franchise, part of that will be dependent upon what wider options we have and whether franchising has to be brought to an end in any of the franchise arrangements that are in place at the present moment. And again, we don't have clarity on whether that's exactly the approach that's meant to be getting taken.
Colin.
In response to the first point, the government's budget revision last week stated that on the 23rd of July, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury confirmed that the government received £6.5 billion effectively in consequentials, including £448 million for rail, but you're only allocating £350 million for the EMA. So I'm a bit curious as to what the other £100 million has gone to, if it's not real. That's an aside. The main point of my second question is the fact that you received a letter last week from Strathclyde Passenger Transport in which they indicated that they were concerned that the emergency funding for SPT and other transport agencies had now come to an end, and the letter said, and I quote, SPT now faces a severe funding shortfall and that will require cuts in services. So how has that emergency funding been allowed to come to an end? Because you're continuing funding for private companies, bus companies, but obviously there are two parts to non-commercial services. There's the public subsidy and there's the private part, but you're not continuing that support at the moment to transport agencies like SPT.
Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, so there are the principal element around the provision of support that was provided to SPT has been for subway services. So we provided earlier in the year £9 million for both subway and for trams in Glasgow and Edinburgh to meet some of the financial challenges which they were experiencing. They've used a significant element of that funding, but not all of it to date. And I'm present in discussions with the Finance Secretary to look at what further financial support can be provided both to SPT for light rail and also to loading trams. So I'm aware of the pressures and the challenges which they're facing, and we're present in discussions with the Finance Secretary around what further financial support can be provided to both SPT and also to loading tram services in order to help to give them some financial support going forward.
Okay, sorry, Cabinet Secretary, just before we move on, it would be helpful, with your very kind offer to write in with the figures, just to clarify the sales during that period as well for tickets, just for completeness. Oliver, you wanted to ask some questions now. Oliver Mundell.
Yeah, it was, thank you, Convener, it was to move back to public transport, and I know that the Cabinet Secretary said quite a bit of that in response to other questions. But I'm particularly interested on the impact on rural communities. We heard Professor Russell Griggs at committee last week saying that an integrated public transport system would be a number one ask in the south of Scotland, and I know that there are similar issues in other rural parts of the country, and it's just to really understand where the Scottish Government's thinking on that is, and whether you understand that there, particularly at the moment where there's uncertain demand, there's still a need for a frequency of services in rural communities. It's not possible, just because there's a handful of people using a bus or a particular train, you can't take away the service, or else the whole timetable breaks down and the service doesn't meet the needs of people living in rural and remote communities. Cabinet Secretary.
So the member will be aware of the Border Transport Corridor Study, which has been carried out, that looks across a variety of transport modes and the future needs of transport provision in the south of Scotland, and that also sits alongside the appraisal work that's been carried out in the southwest of Scotland in looking at future transport needs, again across different modes in the southwest of Scotland, and that will all be part of our planning and thinking and going forward with the STPR2 process, but it also feeds into our wider transport work around improving and looking at improving rail services. So the member will be aware that we have given a commitment to the Borderlands growth deal arrangement to carry out further work around looking at the option of extending the Borders Railway as well, and the South West appraisal also looks at improving and enhancing rail services into the southwest of Scotland. So I recognise the importance of good transport connectivity, particularly for people who live in rural areas and such as Mr Mundell's constituency. In terms of bus services, they operate in a slightly different way in terms of we do not provide bus services directly itself, but where there is a a clear social need for particular bus services, there is funding provided to local authorities each year to help to provide support to maintain and sustain localised bus services where there is a clear social need to do so. So it's important that, that our regional transport partners play their part in making sure that they're planning local services that help to meet the needs of local communities, where not just where they're profitable, but also where there's a clear social need for that service to be provided.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Do you, you know, in all honesty, think that that system's working well in terms of buses at the moment? Because, you know, again, my experience, you know, locally, but also listening to other members right across the country, you know, is that doesn't always happen, and you know, there's particular aggravators at the moment. You know, when we hear, you know, again, right across the country, people struggling to get to appointments for their flu jab, or you know, to access basic services. Do you think that local authorities are doing enough to recognise those community needs, and do you think that the Scottish Government provides enough funding, particularly at the moment?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, what I do think is important is that some of the decision making around these matters is reflective of what's needed at a local level, rather than it being at a centralised national level. You will be aware that we've made additional provisions within the Transport Act that gives local authorities a range of additional options in looking at how bus services can be provided, whether it be bus improvement partnerships, whether it be franchising, or looking at the possibility of running their own services. Once those powers are introduced through the Transport Act, local authorities will have a greater range of options available to them on how they want to take forward bus services within their local area. So I think if it'd be fair to say that the existing system as it stands doesn't reflect the needs of local communities sufficiently, which is why the additional powers within the Transport Act will assist local authorities in being able to take forward other approaches that they believe that might be better reflective. So what's better in the member's constituency and might work as a better approach isn't necessarily the approach that would be best in my constituency, for example, in Falkirk, but it gives local authorities greater flexibility in trying to address some of the types of issues that the members highlighted.
Oliver, briefly, and then followed by Colin, but they have got to be brief questions, gentlemen, please.
Thank you, Convener. It was just to ask, I mean, obviously, ultimately, there'll be some people in Scotland who just, because of where they live, won't benefit from public transport at all. And it just was with changing travel patterns and other bits and pieces that you still recognise that for some people, you know, road infrastructure and cars will be important, but also, as I think other members will come on to, that broadband, you know, again, is a way of, you know, and good connectivity is a way of helping people access vital services. It's probably more of a statement than a question, Convener.
I think it probably is more of a statement, so I'm going to bring Colin in with his question and see if the Cabinet Secretary can acknowledge your statement and answer Colin's question. Colin.
Absolutely. Cabinet Secretary, you said in response to Oliver Mundell that there are measures in the Transport Act to give, for example, councils powers to run bus services themselves. So why are you delaying the implementation of those powers? They don't have those powers at the moment because you've said that you will not implement the Transport Act in this Parliament. Why don't you get on with the job of giving those councils those powers that you say will help support bus services?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think it's unfair of Mr Smith to try and give the impression as though that I'm acting in some ways to try and prevent these powers from being taken forward. The member will be aware that the Transport Act has a whole range of areas within it, covering a variety of different areas of transport that need to be taken forward in terms of statutory instruments, guidance and regulations, including within bus provision. He will also appreciate the staff and civil servants across the Scottish Government over the course of the last 6 months have had to move towards dealing with the pandemic and the very significant challenges which that has created. And staff have been working incredibly hard over the last couple of months to try and address these issues. As some of those pressures have eased, it's allowed them to then return to some of the priorities that we had prior to the pandemic, and that included taking forward the provisions contained within the Transport Act. So I think it's important that we don't try and characterise this as though anyone is seeking to delay matters. Is that the reality is that the pandemic has had an impact on the ability of staff to be able to deal with the normal day-to-day business, which has resulted in a delay in some of the provisions within the Transport Act being able to be taken forward. So I can assure them there is no intentional delay. This is in part a consequence of staff having to deal with some of the very significant challenges which they've faced during the course of the last 6 months in dealing with the pandemic. And I'm sure all members would recognise that staff have been working as hard as they can to try and address these issues over the course of the recent months.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I'm going to go on to the next set of questions, which are from the Deputy Convener, Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. We're in a situation where there's much greater home working and virtual meetings, and we don't know how long that's going to continue. Possibly it's going to end up still being greater than it was pre-pandemic. Transport Scotland assessment tools places great emphasis on work-related journey time savings. So given the new situation that we're in, is Transport Scotland thinking about revising its assessment tools, given that the validity of the previous approach is not as great as it now is?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I'd like to think we had some foresight into this, but the member will be maybe aware that in the National Transport Strategy, we set out a commitment to revise the assessment tool which we use, which is primarily the stag appraisal system. And we gave a commitment to undertake a review of that process, which we intend to do. That becomes all the more important now, given the changing nature of people's travelling behaviour and the way in which that could have an impact on the transport system going forward, and how the assessment tool takes that into account. So yes, I can give the member an assurance that we are going to review it, and of course it is going to have to look at what the new normal is in terms of the changing nature of how people are actually using public transport, and also how we take account of the way in which people have changed their working behaviour, with greater numbers working at home, and what that will mean for any assessments that we carry out in the future.
That's good to hear, Cabinet Secretary, and I hope the committee has a chance to discuss the proposals on that with you. Up till now, the Scottish Government's investment in active travel infrastructure has largely been channelled through Sustrans. Given the increased importance of walking and cycling investment, do you intend to review that arrangement? I mean, there have been calls in the evidence we've been taking for a much more decentralised approach, looking at the local authorities' priorities, and we've seen so much money being given to local authorities at the moment to put in, as you've already said, wider pavements and things to increase distance of people passing each other. So is this something that might be looked at in the longer term to increase the decentralisation of active travel budgets?
Well, I think the first thing I would want to see is the nature and style of active travel infrastructure at a local level is determined by the local authority. So where are the partners that they're working with? The funding mechanism and the support that's provided in taking that forward is facilitated through Sustrans. So the design and expertise that Sustrans can bring to the table can support local authorities who may not have the internal capacity or expertise to take forward a project of that nature. And Sustrans are able to give them that type of expert support and guidance, and also to link them in with other local authorities that may be able to give them some guidance and assistance around projects that they've previously taken forward that they could find it useful. So it acts as a very, very helpful tool in drawing that expertise and sharing experience that I think is critical to helping to to make sure we're investing in good quality cycling and active travel infrastructure. The other thing as well is that I think it's important to acknowledge the increase in funding which has been made available to local authorities directly over and above the funding which we provide through Sustrans. So local authorities received £23.9 million of capital funding in this financial year, which has gone directly to them. That's an uplift of £15 million on the previous year's budget. The amount of money that's going direct to local authorities to use for their own purposes and how they want to use it has markedly increased. Alongside that, the funding which is available through the Sustrans envelope is also shaped by what local demand and local plans are, but Sustrans are able to provide them with the type of management experience and assistance that some local authorities may not have available to them. So I think a combination of the direct funding to local authorities plus the Sustrans funding is the right balance and can help to make sure that we're getting the right type of investment in active travel infrastructure.
I mean, these are huge sums that have gone to local authorities pretty quickly. Are you or tasking Sustrans to do an impact assessment of whether they're successful or not and whether they're valid for the longer term? I mean, I can think of one city where, you know, they've moved the bus stops, so the information that you get at the bus stop is no longer there. How that's going to work when the weather gets worse, you know, is open to question. So is there going to be some assessment of the impact of that huge sums, those huge sums that have been given to local authorities and that they have invested pretty quickly?
So on the Spaces for People project specifically, I'll get Laura Murdoch to say a wee bit more about the evaluation process it's going to be taking forward, because there will be an evaluation of it. I'm also very conscious that many local authorities are working at pace with this and are taking some of these projects forward at a very quick speed. And there will be a need for those projects to be adapted and altered on the basis of experience, and that's what they are being encouraged to do. So where they experience difficulties or challenges that are creating unintended difficulties, then they should be looking to adapt the scheme to reflect that. But I can assure the member there is an evaluation process that Sustrans are taking forward with local authorities to look at these, and I'll ask Laura to say a little more about the evaluation process.
And Laura, you can obviously come in, but could I ask you to be briefly? I've been sat here at the end of this table thinking that people could see me waving when I wanted to move on to the next question. Little did I realise no one could see me. I thought you were just all ignoring me. But I am worried about time, just to allow every member to come in. So Laura, could you come in briefly? Then I want to go to Colin, and then I want to come back to Maureen.
Certainly. So in terms of Spaces for People, there is a evaluation framework that has been developed between Sustrans and Scots in partnership. And that national monitoring and evaluation framework has been shared with all local authorities, and that will be the basis on which Spaces for People will be evaluated. Thank
you, Laura. Colin, briefly, and then back to Maureen.
Cabinet Secretary, you said that you had repurposed £39 million from Places for Everyone because councils weren't able to spend that. I have to say I've never heard a single council say that. I'm curious as to why that's the only active travel is the only capital spending you think needs to be repurposed, because councils can't spend that, but they can continue to spend on roads. But the big concern I have is that of that 39 million, 12.5 million has gone to Glasgow and Edinburgh, and that's understandable given what the Spaces for People was for. But when it comes to future active travel funding, how are you going to ensure there isn't a disproportionate spend on big cities and those areas that have missed out and not received a fairer share will receive a fairer share when it comes to future active travel budgets? Or are we simply going to continue to see a disproportionate element going to big cities?
Briefly, Cabinet Secretary.
So just in terms of the issue about a disproportionate amount going to big cities, actually some of the active travel projects that we just signed off on are actually significant projects, are actually in rural areas. including a couple, I think, a couple in the south of Scotland. In relation to the spaces for people specifically, the vast majority of the funding that was applied for by local authorities, including those within rural areas, has been met. So there will only be a small number of local authorities where the request that we received from them was not achieved. I don't know if Laura Murdoch can maybe say a little more about that, because the vast majority of the bids that came in from the local authorities were met, and we actually increased the pot from the £30 million up to the £39 million in order to accommodate that. So I think some of the bids that have come in from local authorities are reflective of their ambition and the projects they believe that they could take forward. But Laura can say a bit more about how we were able to meet the vast majority of local authority requests.
Indeed. So nearly every local authority has actually bid into Spaces for People, and Sustrans are working with local authorities they have never worked with before in terms of the temporary active travel infrastructure projects. And I hope that that bodes well in terms of future plans for permanent active travel projects and the ambition of local authorities all across Scotland to bid in for that. So I think it has been extremely encouraging, the spread that we have seen of interest and ambition through Spaces for People, which resulted in, as the Cabinet Secretary has said, us having to increase the budget to accommodate that.
Thank you. Maureen, back to you.
Thank you. We also heard in our evidence taking a call for greater coherence between transport policy and investment and matters such as land use planning and the rollout of broadband and 5G networks to support climate, health and other goals. Do you think that the Scottish Government and its various departments are working closely enough to achieve this coherence?
I think there's more to do because I do think it's important we see greater coordination between these different areas. Transport is a derived demand. It exists there to facilitate people in being able to undertake activities, whether it be work, whether it be accessing healthcare or education. And that's why it's absolutely critically important that transport and land use are integrated. One of the areas that we are looking to, that we are taking forward to try and address some of this is through our second strategic transport projects review and also the National Planning Framework 4 in order to try and help to make sure that there is the alignment between these areas and that we can ensure that land use decisions from a planning point of view are also looking to make sure that we make greatest use of existing infrastructure, that we're also thinking about how we can reduce the need for people to travel, so whether it's providing greater digital connectivity right from the very outset, but also providing the type of active travel infrastructure as part of any preparation by ensuring that we are facilitating active travel within right from the very outset. So these are the types of things that I think we need to see more progress on, and they are areas that we are actively looking to take forward. And you may recall that in the National Transport Strategy, digital connectivity is one of the key factors that we see as being a need to be aligned alongside how we take forward transport planning, given the impact that it's having on transport, which has been very noticeable over the course of the last 6 to 7 months.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you, Maureen. The next questions are from Peter Chapman. Peter.
Yes, Cabinet Secretary, carrying on the climate change issues, with the committee heard from Professor Ian Doherty that to meet carbon reduction goals, Scotland would have to reduce its vehicle fleet by 1/3. That is 1 million vehicles. And does the Cabinet Secretary accept this argument and this figure? And if so, what action is the Scottish Government taking to meet this goal?
Well, we've set out within the National Transport Strategy the approach that we want to take in terms of the transport hierarchy. And in that, it's very clear that we want to see people moving to a much more sustainable use of transport. So, for example, we want to see folk making greater use of active travel and also public transport. Alongside that, I think Mr. Chapman raises an important issue, is that there is a need not only to encourage people to take forward these, to make use of public transport and greater use of active travel. There's also a need to look at the existing regimes that we have in place around the use of cars. So how can we help to support people moving to low emission vehicles when they are using a vehicle, which we have measures in place to do that. But how we can also make sure that people are making greater use of public transport. But there are also things such as, for example, the policies that cities can take forward in terms of trying to discourage car use in the city centres. And some of the provisions that we've made available within the Transport Act is to help to support local authorities in looking at taking forward these options, part of a mechanism that can help to dissuade people from taking their cars into city centres. So there's I think it's a combination of policies to support people in changing their behaviour, supporting and sustaining public transport, and encouraging the use of active travel, while also incentivising people to look at other modes of transport, particularly when it comes to travelling in our cities. Some of the measures that we've put in the Transport Act is to assist us in trying to achieve that.
Yep. I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. And I mean, it's a good answer, I would argue. And given that focus that we want to help people out of their cars, we want to help them to embrace active travel and public transport. We have heard continued calls for a switch from investment in new road capacity to the maintenance and targeted improvement of existing roads. And this follows on from the previous answer, I would argue. So is this something the Scottish Government is now working to achieve? In other words, the focus is away from building brand new roads, but on, improving what we have rather than improving the capacity on our road network. Is that a focus going forward for the Scottish Government?
So I'm struck by that question, because there's not often a week goes by in the chamber where I'm not called on by one of his colleagues to build a new road somewhere. But I will answer this in the spirit of the question from Mr. Chapman, and that is that we're very clear in terms of the investment hierarchy which was set out in the National Transport Strategy and also in the Draft Infrastructure Investment Plan, which I published just over a week or so ago, which again sets out our priority is to maximise use of existing infrastructure, to improve maintenance of existing infrastructure, and where it is necessary that we put in new infrastructure, and that includes new roads. And in the Draft Infrastructure Investment Plan, Mr. Chapman may not be aware, but we've set out our commitment to double maintenance on roads and bridges on the road network in Scotland, which will increase over the course of the next 5 years that budget by £1.5 billion. So we are prioritising maintenance and enhancing existing infrastructure, which is reflective of the investment hierarchy that will set out in the National Transport Strategy and also in the Draft Infrastructure Investment Plan. So I hope that gives the member an assurance that our direction of travel is that we make best use of existing infrastructure, but there will be occasions where it's necessary for new infrastructure to be invested in. A good example of that that I've set out in recent weeks is an alternative route on the Restingby Thankful, given the long-standing problems which we have there, notwithstanding the investment we're making in maintenance and enhancement in existing infrastructure.
Cabinet Secretary, I want to bring in Maureen, if I may, briefly, and I'm going to make a general plea to everyone. Please, could you help me with short questions and short answers? Because the upshot of this is that the next panel will be delayed, and that will cause me further problems as well with the next Cabinet Secretary when he is made to wait before we get through all these questions. So I urge you please to try and help me. Maureen.
Thank you. Just quickly, Cabinet Secretary, it's funny how once people get good roads in their area, they say that all further road building should stop. So can I just ask whether it's still the Scottish Government's intention to complete the dualling and linking up all our cities with dual carriageways on the A9 and the A96? And also, can I welcome the increase in maintenance and on maintenance of bridges, which will be very welcome in Aberdeenshire?
Very briefly, Cabinet Secretary.
Yes.
That's the kind of answer I like. Thank you. The next question, therefore, is going to come from Angus MacDonald. Angus.
Okay, thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just following on from the general theme that we've been discussing, we know that the Scottish Government has set aside £700,000 for 4 separate grant schemes to support the switch of freight from road to rail and water. So can I ask if you consider that that's a sufficient amount, given that we have the carbon reduction targets and given that it's a similar figure to that allocated in recent years?
There are 2 elements to the financial support that we provide to the freight sector. The first is around the road shift revenue support that we provide, which is the £700,000 alongside the so it's two elements to it: the mode shift revenue support and the waterborne freight grant, which is the £700,000 that Mr MacDonald makes reference to. Both of these are about providing revenue assistance to support in moving across to freight, whether it be by rail or by water. And for example, it may not be a large financial budget, the members, which I recognise the members referring to, but it is, no doubt it's a budget that does make a difference. So for example, that budget will fund 10 rail freight. It flows in 2020-21, of which there will also be, which I believe across the board, it will remove something like 121,000 lorry journeys. The second element is the capital funding which we provide, which is through the Freight Facilities Grant Scheme and the Port Modal Shift Grant Scheme, which provides financial assistance for the infrastructure that's necessary. One which I know the member will be familiar with is the one at Blackford, where we are providing support for the rail facility at Highland Spring, to remove about 80,000 lorries off our roads. And we're also providing, again, a grant fund to a cement factory at Dunbar, which again, to tarmac, which again will help to remove vehicles off roads. So there's 2 elements to it: revenue and capital funding, which we provide to try and help to support move to both water and rail freight.
Angus.
Okay, thanks. That's a helpful clarification. You've mentioned a couple of good examples there, but there have also been successful schemes in the past, including the Radnamara scheme, as it's called in Gaelic, which successfully removed timber and log transport from road to sea on the west coast, taking large trucks off the single track roads. So is there a plan to see these continue, and will funding be provided to allow it to continue?
So over the next 5 years, we're providing £25 million overall to help to support rail freight. So we remain very keen to help to see increases in rail freight. So I can assure the member that we, if there are specific schemes with our partners that are looking to take forward a project and they're looking for some financial support and direction in that, we're very open to having those discussions with them. So it remains a priority for us, and we'll continue to provide what support we reasonably can in taking forward these projects.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much, Angus. The next questions are from Emma Harper. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Just checking that the light is on from a camera. Thanks. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I will consolidate both my questions, given that we seem to have a bit of time constraints, and it might not do justice to my questions about Cairnryan and the Port of Cairnryan. And I know that we've got to deal with COVID, but there's also Brexit looming as well. And given the strategic importance of the Port of Cairnryan, it's the third busiest port in Scotland. It's the shortest crossing to Northern Ireland, and £26 million a day of freight on the A75 east of Dumfries heads to the port, and £10 million a day on the A77. And I know that the Northern Ireland Protocol imposes a requirement for checks on goods between Britain and Ireland. So how confident are you, Cabinet Secretary, that goods will continue to move easily between the port of Cairnryan and Larne and Belfast? And also, has the Scottish Government offered any support to the owners of Cairnryan Port? And has the UK Government been engaging with the Scottish Government as well?
So in terms of capacity on the crossing at Lochrain, the present capacity runs at around 50%, so there is additional capacity available on the existing operation that both Sten and Pinot operating the service if there was an increase in demand. What's unclear at the present moment is the border operating model that the UK Government intending to take forward. We don't have any great detail around that at the present moment. My understanding is details will be published this week around it. What's also unclear is exactly the types of where any checks will take place. I'm conscious that Ms Harper will be very aware of the very limited site there is in Cairnryan for any additional physical infrastructure to be put in place for border checks. And the engagement we've had with the port operators is around looking at an inland facility, so something away from the port itself, where any checks could be undertaken. And we've had some engagement with them around how that could be taken forward. The problem we have is that the UK Government funding for this is the Port Infrastructure Fund, which is to provide the infrastructure for these port checks. The problem is that the funding is limited to only those that can take place on the port itself. But the problem is at Cairnryan, the site is too small for that type of facility to be provided. And we are pursuing with the UK Government the need to look at how that funding can be used flexibly to help to provide the infrastructure that might be necessary out with the port in order to help to meet any border operating model to take forward that would require checks to be carried out at Cairnryan. So we continue to engage with the UK Government on this matter, but there is a need for greater clarity around the model they intend to operate and flexibility around the funding they're providing to help to support any model that's been implemented.
Emma.
Thanks. I'll keep it short, Convener. My worry is that we're like less than 87 days now. Is all of this going to be ready so that delays won't be incurred because of I have issues with livestock and then a lot of temperature controlled freight as well? So delays can't be part of any of this consideration.
Well, there's a wider issue in terms of not probably so much for the crossing to Northern Ireland, but particularly for the short straits into Dover, where we have about 30 trucks a day that carry seafood, some of which is live seafood, another live produce, fresh produce that's time critical. There are concerns about delays that could take place at the short straits. Last week I had a meeting with the Road Haulage Association, who have got very significant concerns about the way in which this has been taken forward by the UK Government. One, they don't know what the border operating model will be. Two, the IT infrastructure that's meant to be put in place for it has not been tested yet, and they don't know how resilient it will be. Three, they don't know what arrangements will be put in place in order to mitigate any delays that are caused, to try, particularly for those who've got time critical goods. And these are issues that we continue to pursue with the UK Government. So there is clear concern within the industry about what appears to be a lack of clarity around exactly how things are going to operate and how any potential delays that do occur, how they will be addressed. particularly for those that carry time-critical goods.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The next question will be from John Finney. John.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I want to follow up on that particular point there. You'll be aware that the UK Cabinet Office has come up with a scenario. They say it's a worst-case scenario, but given their previous information, we remain to see if that's the case. And the scenario would be a maximum queues of 7,000 port-bound trucks in Kent and associated delays of up to 2 days. I note what you say about concerns and that you're pursuing this, but can I specifically ask you, has the Scottish Government undertaken any assessment of possible impact of the delays at major English ports following the end of the transition period, the implications of Scottish trade with the EU, particularly as you highlight the value of perishable goods such as seafood, please?
So, Convener, this was part of our thinking earlier in the year in preparing for Brexit, and we had developed some contingency plans around trying to meet challenges that the sector could face. So, for example, if there were significant delays at the short straits in Dover, one of the proposals which we put forward was that those vehicles which are carrying perishable goods is that they are prioritised. There was an undertaking on the part of the DFT, and certainly the discussion I was involved in with Michael Gove at the time, was that they would look at how they could try to speed up the process for those that are carrying perishable goods, particularly those that are carrying live seafood, where it is so time critical. However, we don't have clarity on this occasion as to what will happen, and we have again highlighted the need to have some sort of contingency arrangement in place in relation to the short straits. We are also considering our own planning around what alternative measures we could put in place that could seek to try and bypass the short straits to help to support the sector, and that forms part of our ongoing planning work around potential delays that are caused by delays in the short straits. So it's an issue we're very alive to, and it's one that's factored into our own contingency planning.
Thank you,
Briefly,
Cabinet. Sorry, John, did you have a follow-up?
Very briefly, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, thank you for that. And I know there's you talk about contingency plans. You've particularly focused on the short crossing there, and you'll be aware there's a permit scheme suggested to be introduced. But my question was broader than that. There are other English ports where produce is exported. Can you give an assurance that it's not simply Dover, but beyond that you're looking, please?
No, it's correct. It's not just Dover we're looking at, although that's a principal area where there are concerns. What I should also say is that we will not be able to mitigate all of the difficulties that are caused by any delays, but we are trying to factor it. I can assure you, we are factoring it into our own thinking about what alternative options could be made available, but there is still a lack of clarity around exactly how issues are going to be taken forward. And it was very clear from the discussion I had with the RHA last week is that they have very significant concerns about how the UK government are managing this and how they will resolve some of these difficulties, which they believe will start to develop very quickly if they don't make progress in sorting these issues out in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And Angus, I think you're happy your questions on that have been answered. So I will move on, if that's all right, to the next questions, which are from Stuart Stevenson. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. Recognising that some of what I would have asked has been covered, I'll consolidate it probably to get a brief answer. Basically, I talked earlier about behaviour shifts in people's working patterns and travel, and that leads us to the blended work model, sometimes working at home, sometimes working. And obviously, digital connectivity is important in that, and perhaps local provision of hubs, shared workplace hubs being part of that solution. And the general issue is just how are you diverting support? People at home are getting the kind of access to digital infrastructure that they need.
I'm trying to be brief, Convener. Obviously, driving forward our R100 programme and also the remaining parts of our DSSB programme are absolutely critical to helping to support digital connectivity. I think in the last 6 months, the importance of digital connectivity has been more apparent than ever, and the need to make sure that people have access to good digital connectivity. We're also trying to help to support and sustain people in being able to continue to work from home. So, for example, the member will be aware in our programme for government, we set out the Work Local Challenge programme, which is looking at trying to create local work hubs and local office space solutions to enhance people staying within their own local area, to reduce the need for them to travel. So driving forward our DSSB programme, which will continue for the remainder of this year, alongside moving forward with our R100 programme, are all critical to supporting people in getting the right type of digital connectivity that they require to help to support them in working from home, given the big increase we saw in the numbers of people who are working from home in recent months.
Stuart.
Over to you, Convener.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you. I do actually have a couple of quick questions which I think can almost be dealt with, can be dealt with very briefly. Can the Cabinet Secretary, can you provide us a very brief update on the status of the North lot, and are you still confident the contract will be signed by December?
Yeah, the legal dispute has been resolved, and we are working towards having the contract signed by the end of this calendar year.
Okay, and the follow-on to that is, when the contract is signed, hopefully in December, can you confirm that at that stage it will be made clear when the work in the lot will be delivered by, i.e., when will it be complete? So if it's signed in December, will you let us know at that stage when the work will be completed by?
Yeah, we'll be in a better position then to be able to give you a clear outline of what the timeline is forward at that point.
I'm not sure if that's a yes. You said you'd be in a better position to. You didn't indicate that you were going to. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly where we'll be able to give you the time for when it will be complete, but I'm sure we'll be able to give you the details of the timeline that we've agreed with BT Openreach in taking forward the Northern lot. Okay, so I mean, my point is, sorry to Cabinet Secretary.
And I'm just hesitant in giving you that on the basis that I don't know off the top of my head of exactly whether that will be detailed at the time when we conclude the contract. But if it is, we'll be able to give it to you, but we'll certainly be able to give you a much clearer indication around the time frame. Okay, I mean, I'm just assuming that when the contract's signed, part of the contract will be when it's completed by, and I'm just asking if that's information will be published on as soon after the contract is signed as possible. Yes, would do. I'll take that point away, Convener, to try and make sure that we can address that for you. Okay. Mike Rumbles, I think you've got the next questions, Mike.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, could you update us on the uptake of both the £400 and the £5,000 voucher schemes for the broadband connections? And is the uptake so far in these early days, is it in line with your expectations?
Well, the scheme for the voucher scheme was only launched on the 8th of September, so it's very early days. So it's a short time scale to gauge that. It'd be fair to say experience of voucher schemes in other parts of the UK tends to demonstrate that uptake can be slow. What I can say to you at the present moment, there are some 32 suppliers that have been approved in taking forward the voucher scheme for us, and 11 more are presently pending being able to do that. And from those who are approved suppliers, 20 applications have been submitted, and we expect more to come in as a result of going forward. So none have been issued as yet, but again, it is only a month since it opened up. But we are making good progress with suppliers, and some of the applications that have that are now being considered would allow us to look at taking forward some of this in the months ahead.
Well, just to let you know, there is some confusion that I've had from constituents across the region, that there is confusion between the £400 voucher is clearly meant to be for those people who are likely to get connected to the broadband scheme, the R100, after the end of next year. But there's a little bit of confusion whether that takes them off the broadband scheme altogether. So out there in the public, I think there's still a little bit of confusion over this. But can you also confirm whether everyone can access the scheme's address checker so they can be certain of when they are likely to get broadband? Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah.
Sorry?
I'm just wondering whether you understand what I'm saying. There are obviously the £400 scheme and there's the £5,000 scheme. The £400 scheme is designed so that people can get a connection who are not likely to get it by the end of next year. And the £5,000 scheme is for those people who are not going to get it, basically. And this is to help them. And there's a little bit of confusion that I have discovered amongst constituents as to there's a little bit of confusion about the £400 scheme, whether that takes them out of the system. These are the questions that I've been having, and I'd like you to make that clear that it is simply caused by the delay, and doesn't take them out of the scheme.
Let me check the specific point that the member's raising, that you feel there's some confusion around, in order to provide the clarity you need for your constituents. If it'd be helpful, I'd be more than happy to write to the member specifically to address that issue.
I think, Cabinet Secretary, in writing to the member, as it's been raised here, it'd be helpful if the committee could have that as well, so we can all understand the points that are being raised. And Maureen Watt wants to come in with a sorry, Mike.
The Cabinet Secretary didn't get to my other question, which was about can everybody access the scheme's address checker now, that people can put this into the system? Can everybody get access to that? Is it working?
Yeah, I'm just looking at details around it. As far as I'm aware, the address checker is operating. It's already had something like 14,000 visitors to it, of which 83% are first-time users. And it has and it appears to be proving to be very popular. So, as far as I'm aware, if there are some technical issues around some areas where it's not operating at the present moment for particular issues, more than happy to try and get that addressed. If the committee or Mr. Rumbles has some specific examples that he wants us to look into, we can take that away and make sure that it is being addressed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Yes, just quickly, Cabinet Secretary, we got a very helpful letter from Paul Wheelhouse to the convener on the 30th of September with various scenarios outlined on how they can access the online checker. But can I ask, it also goes into the number of houses to be connected in the central and south lots. Can I ask that once you sign the contract for the north lot, that we get a similar letter to say, how many premises are being covered by what, and how many, there'll be left over for the broadband voucher scheme?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to take that away to make sure we follow that up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just one question. I see in the £5,000 capital grant to allow people to connect to broadband. In Wales, they've understood that in remote rural areas it may exceed that, and are actually making £7,500 available in remote rural areas. Cabinet Secretary, if it becomes apparent that £5,000 isn't going to be sufficient in remote rural areas per property, will you look at matching what is happening in Wales?
Well, I don't know what is happening in Wales, and I don't know how comparable their scheme is to our scheme with the underlying R100 programme. So, more than happy to take away the point and look at it, but I don't know how their existing scheme compares to the R100 programme that we are taking forward.
Thank you. It'd be helpful if you could come back to us on that. And at that stage, I think we have come to the end of our questions. I hope I haven't missed anyone off. Cabinet Secretary, thank you, and to you and your team for attending and giving evidence this morning. And I would now like to suspend the meeting till 11 o'clock, when we will take our second panel of evidence. So thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and I suspend the meeting. I'd now like to resume our meeting where we've got a focus on the COVID-19 and financial scrutiny. This panel that we're about to go into will focus on agriculture, fisheries and aquaculture. Before we go in to this panel, I'd like to ask members if there are any members I'd like to ask if there are any members who'd like to declare any interest, and perhaps I could kick this off by saying that I am a member of a family farming partnership. Angus, I think you wanted to say something, followed by Peter and then Stuart. Angus.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I should declare that I own properties in Crofton Township in the Western Isles, but derive no income from them. Thank
you very much, Angus. Peter, you wanted to declare an interest.
Absolutely, Convener. I declare an interest in a farming partnership in the North East.
Thank you. And Stuart, I think you wanted to declare an interest.
I am a joint owner of a very small registered agricultural holding from which I derive no income. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Stuart. And I'd like to now go on and welcome the panel today. First of all, I'd like to welcome Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Tourism. I'd like to welcome Catriona McLean, the Head of Rural Economy and Communities Division, Cherie Donnelly, the Head of Finance, Jonathan Pickstone, the Deputy Director of the Regional Economic Development, and Alan Gibb, the Acting Deputy Director of Fisheries. Cabinet Secretary, I'm sorry we're slightly later than we anticipated, but I would like to offer you the opportunity to make a short opening statement of up to 3 minutes. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, everybody. This unprecedented pandemic has caused exceptional pressures on the people of Scotland's health, economy and society. The Scottish GDP fell 19.4% in the second quarter of 2020. The Scottish Government has already allocated more than £2.3 billion, that's £2,300 million, to help businesses and protect jobs during this COVID crisis. We can build our rural economy with well-being and with green recovery at its heart. Our ambitious woodland creation targets are directly supported by £150 million, Convener, from the Low Carbon Fund. We've committed £250 million to funding peatland restoration for the next 10 years, enabling land managers to plan with confidence. The launch of the Agricultural Transformation Programme last month begins the work of moving to a post-CAP support system better to support sectors' response to the climate crisis. The Scottish Government was quick to respond to the needs of our fishing and aquaculture industries, and it's crucial that the UK Government provides a future funding guarantee that matches the multi-year certainty of funding that we would have enjoyed had Scotland remained in the EU. Our food and drink industry has been one of our strongest economic performers, Convener, but models suggest a 20% reduction in turnover due to COVID-19, and we're working with the sector to develop and launch our joint recovery plan. On top of COVID-19, we now face the prospect of a no-deal or a low-deal Brexit. We must prepare, therefore, for the possibility of tariffs and quotas on agricultural products in just 3 months' time. As we have discussed here many times before, sectors like sheep meat could be hit extremely hard. Sectors that need transitional support should be able to get it. We expect the UK Government to provide this support and continue to work with Welsh colleagues to push the UK Government to restart work on this. We need to provide the support to the sheep sector when they need it. The Scottish Government can only continue to support a thriving rural Scotland if properly funded and afforded sufficient time to plan. Finally, Convener, the UK Government's recent decision not to set a budget, along with the confusion over the future EU trading relationship in just a few short months, brings unacceptable uncertainty to people's livelihoods. I'm very happy with my officials to answer your members' questions.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The first question this morning for you will come from Richard Lyle. Richard.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, at the last committee meeting, you were asked a question which I would like to be clarified. What are the actual numbers employed in the Rural Payments and Services, RPID? What do these people do, and how does that actively contribute to the rural economy and support rural businesses during a crisis like this pandemic?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, there are staff, 385 staff, Mr Lyle, who work out of 17 area offices located around Scotland, from Benbecula to Inverurie, from Lerwick to Dumfries. That figure was taken from a statement in Parliament on 24th of June last year. So that's 385 in RPID local offices. But in addition to that, in the total RPID, including the local but also the head offices, have varied from 436 in 2017 to 441 in 2020. In other words, there's a risk of confusing these two figures. 385 is essentially the local offices, and the higher figure, which as I say is now 441, represents the local offices plus the head office contingent that deal with head office functions. Overall, Convener, I'm very proud of the excellent work that RPID staff have done, especially when during COVID, the vast majority of them have been working from home with actually increased productivity, judged from the fact that they secured and succeeded in both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 targets, which is an extremely creditable result. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's good to get that cleared up. Right. Can I ask you, does the Scottish Government see a need to provide any additional short to medium funding for rural economy sectors whilst the effects of COVID-19 are still ongoing? And if so, where will this funding possibly be targeted?
Okay, well, thanks, Convener. I think, first of all, I would say that we have already delivered COVID compensation, particularly to the marine sector, and I can give details of that, but I'll just answer it generally for the time being. But in the marine sector, particularly the inshore shellfish sector is hit very hard, and also in aquaculture as well. The farming sector has managed to carry on throughout COVID in most respects, but it has been affected as well in particular ways. And I'm thinking of the arable and dairy sector. But we haven't identified a particular need in the farming side of things for bespoke transitional support. I think there is, however, still very much a risk, because we see the COVID numbers rising, that if further measures have to be taken, then of course we couldn't discount the need for additional compensation if that were to affect the farming sector as well. And finally, Convener, as I said, we are very worried that if there is a no deal and WTO tariffs apply at a range of, I think, around 40 or 50% for example, sheep meat, that really could decimate the sector. And we have to bear that in mind. And we have to be able to have some ability to make contingency plans. Although, of course, since Brexit is the UK government policy, then we would expect them to adhere to the assurances that Michael Gove gave me in person, and the IMG, the inter-ministerial groups with the devolved administrations, that the UK Treasury will pay for any Brexit transitional costs arising from a no-deal situation.
Thank you for that, Secretary. Back to you, Convener.
Thank you, Richard. The next questions are from Peter Chapman. Peter.
Scotland's rural economy sectors are facing concurrent challenges of recovering from COVID-19, uncertainty due to Brexit, and the need to tackle climate change and biodiversity loss. And on top of all that, there is still a target, I believe, of doubling the food and drink sector, £15 billion to £30 billion by 2030. So does the Scottish Government still share all these objectives? And if so, how will funding be targeted to achieve them?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, Convener, we still have high ambition for our food and drink sector, and great admiration for the work that farmers have done throughout Scotland. Very hard work, arduous work, continuing to put food on the plate for people in Scotland and quite further afield. I'm very pleased, Convener, that we have managed to ensure continued reliability of the various payment streams within Pillar 1 and 2. Particularly pleased, incidentally, that the Pillar 1 payments, loan payments, which in effect are de facto advance payments, were made starting, I think, from around the 1st of September of, in most cases, around 95% of entitlement. That means that most farmers received most of their basic payment entitlement around 3 months ahead of the rest of the UK. Now, why is that important? Because money in the bank account, money in the pocket, means that farmers can then make investments, can make improvements, can carry out, as I know many of them have done, improvements in fencing, for example. That had a knock-on effect, Convener, to the sawmill sector, providing it with a boost at a time when that boost was much needed. It enabled payment to hauliers, to feed suppliers, to contractors, to the whole supply chain. So I regard that part of the responsibilities that I have as extremely important, and I obviously look forward to updating Parliament as to the future plans for stability of payments up to 2024. And my impression is that, you know, that probably is the foremost thing, to answer Mr. Chapman's question, that we can do to assist farmers and crofters throughout this period of maximum uncertainty. Although until the Brexit mist has cleared, I think anyone would and everyone would accept that we need to reserve our position about how precisely we should go ahead beyond 2024 till we see how the post-Brexit landscape looks.
Peter.
Thank you. I mean, thank you for that answer. But I mean, the industry is desperately needing some clarity going forward. So I ask, when will we hear from the advisory group? We heard originally that it was going to report by Highland Showtime. Now we're almost 4 months beyond that now, Cabinet Secretary, and we still don't know what this advisory group are saying. So why the delay, and when will we hear what their recommendations are?
Well, first of all, I think most people would accept, Convener, that since this group was formed, we have been hit by the enormous impact of the COVID crisis. And quite rightly, therefore, the group has determined that they wanted to take that into account, and therefore that was a factor which led them to decide that they would want to take on more evidence. Secondly, the thing which Mr. Chapman didn't mention is that we have recently committed in the programme for government to take forward farmer-led groups to inform us in particular how we are going to tackle climate change in adaptation of farming practices. So to do, the first of these reports should be available fairly shortly from former NFUS President Jim Walker on suckler beef. And I expect that work, led as it is by experienced, respected farmers in the sector, will perhaps provide a route map of how best to respond to the climate change challenge. And I can give a little bit more detail on that later on. As far as publication of the Food and Farming Production Advisory Group support, that advisory group support will, I hope, be available before the turn of the year, possibly earlier. The group is independent of government. It was set up on a resolution of Parliament containing an amendment which was put forward by Mr Rumbles with the support of the Scottish Government and Parliament, as I recall. And therefore it is an independent group, and it's right that it should come to its conclusions. I don't actually sense that there is, Mr Chapman, a huge clamour that we get this particular report out. I think, you know, my feeling is that farmers firstly want us to make sure that the money is in the bank. Number one, practical business concern. And number two, provide clarity as to whether or not the sheep sector is going to be hit with tariffs of 50% in just a few months' time. these are the present dangers, as is, finally, Convener, the question of equivalence of standards in respect of imports of cheap meat from other countries that may not observe the high standards of animal welfare, hygiene and abattoir practices that must, of necessity and rightly, be applied here.
Peter.
Yeah, well, I hear all that, Cabinet Secretary, and you know, I agree that the short-term funding is vitally important, and there are questions out there. I accept that as well. So, what changes to funding priorities do you envisage in the short term, and what are envisaged in the longer term, as far as you can outline at this point?
Sure. Well, I think it's fair to say that the main change, Convener, that we will see over coming years and looking 5-10 years ahead is an increasing focus on tackling climate change. And that's why we've made a start with the Agricultural Transformation Programme. It's why we've announced £150 million for forestry, and it's why we've announced £250 million over the next 10 years for peatland restoration. Now, I'm very keen that when we translate the overall funding support packages which have traditionally been available under the CAP and Pillar 1, Pillar 2, that we reflect the important contribution that farmers and crofters make in that respect. And in other words, I think that farmers and crofters already do a great deal for the environment, not all of which they get credit for, in providing permanent grassland, which is terrific for biodiversity, as several NGOs agree, I believe, and in providing a managed landscape, which is at the heart of our tourism attraction, as well as being at the centre of rural communities. So I want to make sure that as we devise and design ways in which to tackle climate change, Convener, that farmers and crofters are at the heart of that, so that we get maximum buy-in, and we're not dictating top-down policies, but we're working with the grain, with individual well-respected farmers, to come up with ways in which farming practices can tackle climate change. I think that practical, pragmatic approach, again, is the best approach that I can think of for us to most likely achieve our climate change targets, working as I do closely with my colleague and friend, Rosanna Cunningham.
Thank you, Peter. We're going to move on. Peter, hold on. I'm sorry. I think that was as far as you were going on that particular area. I wanted to bring in Colin at this stage. If there's a point for you want to come back in, just let me know. But over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Convener. Just following on from Peter Chapman's questions, obviously a key component of the recent agriculture bill was around pilot schemes for new approaches. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, what's the current position on how these pilot schemes will be funded and when we're likely to see them happen?
Okay, well, first of all, SNH are already working in respect of pilot schemes. Secondly, in respect of funding of the pilot schemes, I would expect that would come from Pillar 2 and possibly BU funding. And thirdly, we expect that the Farming and Food Production Group will give advice about pilot schemes. And finally, I would expect that we would consider pilot schemes in relation to the report and outcome of the farmer-led group, starting with Jim Walker's Suckler Beef Group.
Colin.
Can I turn, Convener, just to the wider rural economy, maybe just beyond agriculture? It's clear that COVID will be with us for some time to come, and there will be an urgent need for tailored support for rural businesses. You know, an example I know the Cabinet Secretary has strong views on is around the recent rules around self-catering providers, for example. The two-household rule is now going to have a significant impact on those providers in the coming weeks in the run up to the holidays. So can the Cabinet Secretary tell us what he sees as the immediate short-term priorities for support for rural businesses?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think the members asked me to generalise. You know, I don't think I can quite do that. I think so far as farming goes, the important thing is that we get the money out to farmers as quickly as possible. Convener, I do hope and expect to secure time for a parliamentary statement, possibly in early November, in order to bring forward details of the payment schedule. So I can give notice of that now. It's correct that I share this information with Parliament. Secondly, in respect of tourism, although I'm not sure that this is to be covered today, but the member is correct that we have provided significant support for self-catering properties already, and I know that that has been appreciated, but I don't underestimate the impacts. And I have indeed engaged in recent days with Fiona Campbell, who speaks on behalf of the ASSC in that regard, and our engagement is continuous. And I know that from discussions, some self-catering businesses are doing very well, but others are absolutely finding it extremely difficult. So I think, Mr. Smith raises an interesting point that there is generally a need for more support in the tourism sector of the rural economy. And here I think we really do need to work and continue to work with the UK government, whose decision to replace the furlough scheme with something which I think is agreed by industry as pretty much not fit for purpose was a mistake. But I hope that they will review that, and the Tourism Task Force report is expected shortly, and it will make recommendations which I would wish to debate with the UK government. As far as the fisheries side, I'm very worried about the shellfish sector and the prawn market, the nephrops sector.
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr. Smith asked me. Mr. Smith asked me about the whole rural economy, so I'm just trying to answer.
And I'm sure you could answer for an extremely long period of time, which may mean that no other committee member gets a question in, which would upset them.
He did ask the general question.
I know, and I'm going to try and get him to focus down. I think he's got a brief follow-up that he wants to do. And just you, Cabinet Secretary, I think have been confused about me as name changes. I think SNH have become Nature Scott under the latest name change. Yeah. So, Colin.
Thank you. The reference to self-catering is, of course, the fact that many business in rural areas have self-catering accommodation as part of a wider business model, including agriculture as well. So it's quite a specific challenge for rural communities. But just generally, the committee has taken evidence on the budget from a range of stakeholders in rural areas about the types of support that's needed for businesses. One example I'll give very briefly is that Savour the Flavours made a point that it's essential that small and micro businesses, including those without growth ambitions, receive needs-based support that is appropriate to their capacity. For example, a small shop in a rural village is more likely to require advisory support in succession planning, improving environmental efficiency in HR, rather than, say, e-commerce or innovation support. So I'm just keen what the Cabinet Secretary is doing to ensure that the support that is given to those businesses in rural areas is very much tailored to the specific needs of those businesses rather than just general.
Specifically, Cabinet Secretary.
Well, different businesses need different support. Some of the non-agricultural businesses will, of course, access support from the Business Gateway, a service delivered by Local Government Economic Development Department. Others will obtain support via the Scottish Government from our contracts with bodies such as the SRUC. I think it is correct to say that that different types of businesses need different support, and that it is desirable that we ensure that it is provided where it is needed across a whole range of government departments, not only my own, but others as well.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next question, which is from Oliver Mundell. Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. That question neatly leads on to my own. Cabinet Secretary, the rural issues are often at the bottom of the priority list across a number of government departments. I think we've heard in evidence, and I also heard from rural leaders yesterday in a round table that there's a sort of seemingly a silo approach where things like housing and education in rural areas don't get the same focus they deserve. And it's just what you're doing as we look at the budget to make sure that your colleagues around the cabinet table and right through government get the challenges that the people in rural areas face.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I heard what the member said, but I'm afraid I just don't agree with the characterisation at all. I don't think that rural is at the bottom of the pile. I don't think that we're operating in silos at all. So I must respectfully disagree. I would point out, actually, that the Agricultural Champions report recommended rural proofing, and this was a recommendation accepted by the Scottish Government. So I can assure the member that I work very closely with, for example, Mr Hepburn in respect of skills and tourism, in respect of with Ms Campbell and Mr Stewart in respect of housing and planning, in respect of Ms Forbes in respect of support for tourism over finance. We speak to each other all the time. In fact, I'm due to be on a meeting at 12 o'clock, which I imagine might be postponed because I'll be answering questions here, given the postponement, the late finish of the earlier session. But I just don't accept the premise at all. I do think we constantly need to strive to make sure that we're collaborating across government fully and effectively. And government, of course, is a big beast. You know, there's lots of parts to it. So it's not an unfair question to ask, but I do thoroughly reject the characterisation of the position.
Cabinet Secretary, I'm sure rural leaders and those living in rural communities will watch on with interest, but I'm happy to leave that line of questioning there, Convener, and I'll come back in later on a different topic.
Okay, thank you very much. And yes, the next questions are from the Deputy Convener, Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Can I ask whether commitments around the green recovery and well-being economy have changed spending priorities within the rural economy portfolio?
Yes, they have. I think we all acknowledge the climate change challenge, and that has impacts on many portfolios and rural in particular. And that's precisely why I made the decision to set up farmer-led groups so that we can have a pathway, a route map about adapting farming practices to become ever more sustainable, to cut methane emissions from cattle, for example, to improve the health of livestock, to improve the kind of marketing cycle of beef cattle, for example, to adapt that. On a whole practical ways, my view, Convener, is that the best way to get things done and to get policy change, which we require to answer Ms Watt's question, to tackle climate change, is to bring together farming leaders, well respected, who can come up with really practical ideas. It's far more likely, in my view, that will get buy-in, that will get take-up, that the policies will be informed by what is practical and achievable and deliverable, than, you know, if I, as a background of a solicitor, came up with similar ideas, not having had that wealth of experience. So, yes, we have changed our view. Yes, myself and Ms Cunningham are working extremely hard on this. Yes, our future priorities and our funding must tackle this. And yes, as I said, finally, in the introduction, 150 million extra for forestry, 250 million for peatland, agricultural transformation programme. You know, we've set out these programmes and initiatives and funding packages precisely because we know that we have to do this in order to work towards meeting our climate change targets.
Thank you. Maureen?
Thank you for that answer. There have clearly been conversations recently about the whole conditionality in public funding, and I just wondered what impact that has had within your portfolio with regard to the spending priorities.
We are, as I say, looking to in future devise funding support packages for rural Scotland, which in time will replace the existing schemes, which apply up to 2024, of course, under our 218 Stability and Simplicity document. And I think that timescale of 4 years gives us enough time to shape new policies, which will involve conditionality. You know, I think in future there will be more of an ask of farming in general and crofting to meet climate change targets. There will be more of a conditionality when it comes to obtaining funding. I think that is a general proposition, that's correct. The way in which it applies is very much the topic of the debate. And the last point I make, Convener, is one that is born of experience, that whatever we do, we must make sure that we do it and we finalise policies in time to devise the IT systems and adapt the overall computer systems to make sure that they can be delivered and administered on budget, on time. If I say that slowly and deliberately, it's because one does learn from experience.
There's a lot of smiles round this table, Cabinet Secretary. In our evidence taking and also in our questioning of the Cabinet Secretary previously, a number of stakeholders have touched on the need for place-based approaches, which have very much come to the fore in response to COVID-19 and in rural economies, you know, talking about local food supplies and things like that. Do you think there'll be a change in emphasis in Scottish Government spending with having more of an emphasis on communities, you know, across portfolios and the need for a kind of place-based approach to things?
Well, I think it's a very general proposition, and of course, my budget, or the rural budget, is very much delivered largely to individual businesses, and I think that model is a successful one. It does, of course, have some programmes such as LEADER, which were very much place-based because they were intended really directly to provide significant funding for local community projects where the communities just didn't have the money. You know, to build a new community hall was perhaps one of the greatest successes of LEADER. I can think of Boat of Garton in my own home patch, was a magnificent new facility which up till COVID was used day in, day out. Hugely valuable. New tennis courts in Rothiemurchus. So I think LEADER is something that we really need to protect. I'm not quite sure if we've had clarity from the UK government about programmes like that, which I think you can say are truly place-based. And I think there's an appetite for perhaps extending some of these types of programmes amongst many communities that I visited.
I think you're absolutely right about the LEADER programme, and you know, I hope we can see money from the UK government to keep that going. Can I mention actually, while we're on this, on the Rural Leadership Programme, it's been very popular Scottish Government initiative, and I wondered whether you think it offers value for money and how it might help businesses and communities recover.
I think it's an excellent programme. It was set up, I think, by Julian Pace at Scottish Enterprise, I think about 11 years ago now, although I could be corrected. And it has provided a cohort every year of a substantial number of people, many of whom have been in business, to improve their overall business acumen and skills, to update their understanding of the kind of public sector policy landscape and information about that. Each year, actually, John Scott, MSP, tended to chair a session which I would attend, and I know Ms Watt has attended, as have many other members in this committee, where we had a discussion and dialogue with many of the members. I've never spoken to any single person who hasn't found the course invaluable. And I was able, Convener, I think 3 years ago, as a direct response of a question I was asked at the Q&A session with the graduates, if you like, from the programme, I was asked, well, why is this not operating in the Highlands and Islands area? So after that question, we got it extended to the Highlands and Islands area as a direct result of democracy in action, I suppose you could say. So I would very much want to continue this programme. And lastly, I think we can benefit. We've got, I think, over 500 graduates now. I think that's a resource that we can use, perhaps as mentoring, to help others, younger people, in bringing on their skills. And going back to the question about advice, I think some of the best people to provide advice are senior people in areas of the agricultural economy who've done it, been there, got the T-shirt. And we are actively looking at using that cohort of graduates for that purpose.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen and Cabinet Secretary. Next question is going to come from Stuart Stevenson. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, myself and John Finney after me expect to be asking some questions about fishing. And John in particular is going to ask about the consumption end of the business and green recovery. So I'll ask you about those things. But what I am interested in, building on the answers that you gave to Richard Lyle earlier in this meeting, and in particular in relation to COVID-19 rather than Brexit, what the effects of that have been on the industry and how the Scottish Government has responded to that pandemic, and how that places us for future resilience against similar or other challenges.
Well, if I may, Convener, I think I'd bring in Alan Gibb to give some of the details of the funding that we've, but if I could just say initially that we did announce, I think back on the 25th of March, the first intervention fund for the smaller vessels, the under 12 metres. We started off with that. In fact, simply because Marine Scotland have a very close relationship with the fishing sector, and they know where people are, they know who fishes where for what. I think they were able to administer this scheme so that the recipients were, I think, the first in Britain to get any money at all, which is a signal achievement. But the fishing sector has been hit hard, particularly shellfish, but also processors. And we are worried about tariffs, about labour costs, about the availability of labour, particularly EU labour that we enjoy at the moment, and also issues such as Philippine crew, which has been an ongoing unresolved sore with the UK government. But on the financial side, I wonder, Convener, if I could ask Mr Gibb to give some details of what we've done to help out those in need. Thank you.
Alan.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Just very briefly then, so overall, we have provided some £15 million for seafood businesses and onshore. The fishing sector, for our under 12 metre vessels, which is our smaller inshore vessels, we paid out some £5.2 million for 630 different businesses or applications. And on our over 12 metre sector, larger vessels, but primarily those affected by negative impacts to exports as Nefrop, Langostine vessels, other vessels, some £3.2 million to just under 200 individual vessels. And we also supported our onshore processing sector, aquaculture and trout farming as well, earning £1 million in support. And the Cabinet Secretary is right. We were the first in the UK to get money out to our industry, and the schemes were designed in partnership with the stakeholders before being developed and delivered upon. Thank you.
Stuart?
I'm happy to hand on to Mr Finney at this point, Convener.
John, if Stuart hasn't asked your question already, John.
I'll maybe just get a little bit of clarification, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and panel. Cabinet Secretary, stakeholders and witnesses highlighted the importance of diversification for fisheries, including market diversification and developing a domestic market for Scottish seafood, and indeed diversifying the types of fish that are fished. Will this be a priority for spend for the Scottish Government, please?
Well, I think it is an important area, and just yesterday I had a very good session with three e-NGOs in respect of sustainable fishing generally, and I think this is very much part of it. I think the consumer increasingly wants to see the sustainability of the product that is on the supermarket shelves or elsewhere. I also think we want to see more direct sales. I mean, one of the encouraging signs during COVID has been that where markets have been lost, some enterprising people in the fishing community have done direct sales to the public. I think that's been very encouraging. And, you know, as a sort of market disruptor, you know, I think that's a very good idea. And let's see if we can try and provide support where appropriate to such businesses to sell direct to the public, particularly small businesses. Particularly, I'm thinking of shellfish. I think it has been difficult to persuade the UK consumer to shift from the traditional haddock and cod. The Spanish consumer seems to be much more adventurous in his or her palate. And this has been, I think, a challenge for a long time. But nonetheless, because of the enormous variety of type of fish that offer delicious food and meals, I do think that we should try to do more, and I'm aware that Scottish Seafood are seized of this and drink as well, working on that.
Sorry, we lost you briefly, Cabinet Secretary. John, carry on, sorry.
Yeah, just thank you for that, Cabinet Secretary. Just a brief following up on terms that have been used at least a couple of times already in this session, and that is Scottish Government terms, green recovery and wellbeing economy. How will you ensure that spending priorities within the fishing sector are aligned to that commitment? And will conditionality play a role in any future fisheries funding?
Well, we do this in a number of ways, and I think Mr. Finney will be aware of the discussion paper, the Future Fisheries Management discussion paper, and indeed last Thursday we published the analysis of the 120 responses that we received there too. I was very pleased that our discussion paper proposed that we make marine littering a crime. I have to say it's long overdue. And, you know, my daughter bemoans that I haven't taken action to deal with the plastics in the sea. I get quite a hard time there, I can assure Mr. Finney. I think he may understand the experience from previous days.
But well done with doing.
Well, indeed. So a future conservationist awaits. But to get back to the question, Convener, the remote electronic monitoring, I think, is actually a very, very important development, and all the e-NGOs agreed. As Mr. Finney knows, we're starting off to equip the scallop fleet, those already who don't already have REM, and many do from the larger vessels. And but the FFM goes further than that, and it talks about more ambitious plans to apply remote electronic monitoring with the benefits that it brings in relation to discards, but also being able to track and trace and detect the location, to resolve the relatively small number of gear conflict issues, to also both help convict the guilty and exculpate the innocent in terms of fishing in the wrong area. You know, nobody is satisfied with the situation at the moment, where the lack of an ability to evidence with clarity any alleged incident, it means that there is an inconclusive end to most incidents. I don't know if I put that clearly enough, but REM will bring clarity, and it will help, I think, to exculpate many vessel owners that are wrongly accused of fishing in inappropriate areas or other infringements of the law of the seabed, so and the sea. So I think that convener is probably the most practical aspect of our answer. But the last thing I would say is that, you know, we do in the approach that we take to fishing negotiation and settling of quota have regard to maximum sustainable yield and sustainable levels of fishing. And I should, in completeness to such a wide question, convener, give it the detailed answer it surely merits.
Well, John, just before I come back to you, and yes, sir, we always like detailed answers. I just remind members and you, Cabinet Secretary, if I may, tactfully, that we're actually doing budget scrutiny. So it's not about every single policy that's out there. It's about where the budget scrutiny is going to take account. Just try and remind members of that. I've got a long time this morning to go if everyone's happy to do that. So, John, back to you.
I'm concluded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, then.
Thank you.
Angus MacDonald, we're going to come to you. So, Angus, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. This committee, as well as the ECLA committee, which I also serve on, very much welcome the Scottish Government's announcement of the Blue Economy Action Plan in the PFG. So basically, I'd like to ask, what are your spending priorities for the action plan, and what are the objectives of the plan
Cabinet Secretary.
and the spend?
I'm just looking for the precise detail, which I can't find, but I mean, I can say generally that in terms of the blue economy, the marine part of Scotland is many, many times larger than the landmass. And I think I'm right in saying we have, I think, around about 10% of the marine resource of the whole of the EU. So we have an enormous area which we use for a variety of different purposes. And increasingly we want to build on the various usages of that, but in a more sustainable fashion. I think that's whether it's fishing, whether it's aquaculture, whether it's cruise liners, whether it's leisure craft, whether it's offshore renewables such as offshore wind, whether it's oil and gas. Increasingly, we want to be more sustainable. I don't know if I can maybe ask Mr. Gibb to quote the figure, which I think I have in my mind, but I'm not going to quote it in case it's wrong, Convener. Sensible expedient. So maybe Mr. Gibb could help me out and give Mr. MacDonald the budget figure.
Alan, do come in, and if you get it wrong, the Cabinet Secretary, I'm sure, will correct you. Alan.
Sorry, thank you. Apologies, it broke off there. I'm not sure if the question was the budget figure that we are asking a UK government for in terms of future funding. Was that the question?
Angus, do you want to reiterate it for Alan, just to clarify what you're after, please?
Well, that would be helpful, but basically I'm looking for some detail on what the spend will deliver. For example, are there any pilot schemes underway, or is it too early at this stage to know if it's that advanced or not?
Alan, if you're happy with that,
Yes, I am, Convener. Thank you. So I think in short, it's a relatively recent announcement, so too early to be specific, but in general terms, it's about taking a more holistic strategic approach across the whole range of activities that happen across the marine sector, from offshore wind renewables, fishing, tourism, agriculture sector, trying to have a collective impact on developing some economic growth around these areas. Obviously, there'll be trade-offs and decisions to be taken there. Funding in support of this, so no exact pilots yet. Funding in support of this is dependent on the assurance that the Cabinet Secretary had from the UK government around a replacement of the EMFF European funded scheme, and the Cabinet Secretary put a very sensible request for £1 million to bridge the gap of rightfully received the European Fisheries Fund scheme. Thank you.
Alan, I'm sorry, you were fairly broken up there. I didn't quite understand. I didn't quite catch the figure that you mentioned there. Was it £1 million or several £1 million?
sorry, apologies for IT. So the Cabinet Secretary has written to the UK government stating that it bridges the gap that we would have got from the European funding. The figure that is required should be £62 million would be the figure for the commitment.
Sorry, Alan, you broke up again. If you, I've got million. If you can hold up your fingers.
I can come in if you want.
I'm sorry, I thought you were deferring to Alan, Cabinet Secretary. If you could clarify, it'd be really helpful.
Yes, since I think I'm clearer on the mic, I think the figure is 62 million, and that figure is derived from an analysis of what we would have expected to receive under the EU EMFF budget of 4.4 billion euros, based on our C area of 10.9%, would be around 62 million per annum for the lifetime of the programme, which is 6 to 7 years. So we have written to the UK government in an effort to be helpful to indicate that that is a figure that we think would be reasonable to reflect the responsibilities that we have and the aims that we have to develop the blue economy over the coming years, had we had the security of continued funding that we would have enjoyed as a continuing part of the EU.
Angus.
Yeah, that's helpful, Convener. Thank you. But could I ask that the committee be kept in the loop with regard to any pilot schemes that are progressed, just to keep aware of progress?
Yes, I'm very happy to do that. And there are a wide range of pilot schemes which have been undertaken working with local inshore fisheries management groups, which I think have been pretty well received by and large. So a lot has been done already, but there's a lot more to do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Angus. We now move to Emma Harper for the next lot of questions. Emma.
Sorry, Convener, I had to just step away for a quick second. Cabinet Secretary, a couple of quick questions about the infrastructure investment plan that was published in September, I think, this year. It commits £100 million of the Scottish Rural Development Programme over the next 5 years, and it appears to be less than the total funding that was available in the previous 2014 to 20 period. So I'm interested to know what aspects of the SRDP does the Scottish Government intend to spend the £100 million on? Does it include forestry, for instance? I'm just wondering if the UK Government have sought any advice from the Scottish Government about funding for forestry in the future.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, if I could answer the second part, and perhaps ask Cherie to answer the first part about the budgetary intersect between the Commission and SRDP. But regards to the second part, we have announced the additional 150 million, which is for a nursery development, but also for more planting of more trees to go to our target of 18,000 hectares per annum. But the member is correct that we do engage with the UK Government, and recently I had a conference call with Zach Goldsmith, the Forestry Minister, and he did ask how we have achieved such success in Scotland over recent years in increasing the overall new plantings from a relatively few thousand to 11,000. And we had a good discussion, a good dialogue. There is some cooperation going on in respect of funding in nursery seedlings, new seedlings and nurseries. So there's already some cooperation. I think there's the last point I'll make is an important wider point, Convener. To meet our forestry targets, I think we may need to do an awful lot more across the UK. Confor have done an analysis on this, as have others. And if more is to be done across the UK, then we already plant between 80 and 90% of all the new trees in the UK. And I think that extra can really be done, and perhaps only be done in Scotland. So if the UK wants to achieve its climate change targets, it may well decide that it would be prudent and necessary to fund new plantings in Scotland on a much higher level in order to meet the climate change targets. I think this will be a coming debate. But the question about the technical question, I wonder if I could pass to my official to answer, to give a technical answer. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch who was coming in on
Cherie.
that. Oh, right,
Cherie,
perfect.
Cherie, I think was...
Cherie.
The SRDP programme funds the woodland grants in terms of the existing planting, which is 12,000 hectares. The infrastructure investment plan is funding an additional 130 million to take the increased planting to 18,000 hectares, as the Cabinet Secretary highlighted. Thanks.
Okay. Emma, does that answer your question? And if so, do you want another one?
Yep, I've got just another question. Thank you, Convener. It's regarding the infrastructure investment plan, which commits to investing £525 million aligned to local authority and UK government funds to deliver the next 5 years of £5 billion city, region and regional growth deals. And obviously I have an interest in the Borderlands growth deal. I'm interested in what the intended outcomes of this spend would be for rural areas. Probably the Borderlands is a great example of a rural area that should benefit from funding, but there's wider rural areas obviously to consider across the rest of Scotland.
Sure. Well, in answer to that, I can say that the city deals are dealt with by my colleague Michael Matheson, and we work closely together on this. The priorities for spending within these deals are negotiated, if you like, discussed between the local authorities and others in the area in question, and the Scottish and UK governments working together. And plainly, we in the south of Scotland that Ms Harper represents, there is a number of ways in which the rural economy will benefit from, as I understand it, the planned intention in relation to the spend of the Borders deal there. So she is right that these deals are intended in part to benefit rural economy, but it's not something that's directly within my budget purview, Convener.
Emma?
No, that's fine. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Emma. And we go on to the next question, which is from Angus. Back to you, Angus.
Sticking with the infrastructure investment plan, we know that the Scottish Government's given a commitment to allocate £30 million from the plan towards resourcing the National Islands Plan. So, Cabinet Secretary, can you provide some insight on the extent to which this investment will address priorities related to the rural economy, the nature of support to the rural economy it will provide, and how the spending will be aligned with public objectives around increasing resilience and tackling climate change and serious biodiversity loss?
Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, again, it's not something that's within my direct budgetary control, but I do know that the infrastructure fund allocated 30 million to delivering the plan over the next 5 years, and the National Islands Plan was developed with the input of island communities and local authorities. So this will support a number of areas, including tourism, infrastructure, innovation, energy transition and skills, and will be informed by a consultation which took place last year from April to July, where the team visited 40 islands and organised 61 events with face-to-face meetings involving 1,000 people. So it has been quite a democratic and exhaustive exercise, and it will cover these areas.
Angus.
Okay. Thank you. That's fine. Thank you.
Oh, that's it. Okay, thank you very much. Next questions then are from Oliver Mundell. Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. As we have left the EU and look to come to the end of the transition period, obviously there are opportunities, as we've heard today, for doom-mongering, but there are opportunities to do things differently and better as well. So I wondered if the Cabinet Secretary was in a position, I've asked him before about less favoured areas, is he in a position today to back the NFUS's calls to reinstate ELFA's 2020 payments made in spring next year to 100%? Can he say that with certainty that farmers can expect ELFAS to continue past 2021 with a £65 million budget? And will he commit to retaining the SUS scheme, albeit with added safeguards and better targeting?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I can assure the member that financial support to those farming and crofting in our most fragile and remote areas is a priority for the Scottish Government. It's not possible to circumvent EU rules and reinstate payments to 2018 levels for the 220 scheme, but I've already made it clear, crystal clear, that the convergence monies will be utilised to maintain support in the less favoured areas. And I was clear following the passing of stage 3 that in the Ag Bill that ELFAS would be one of the schemes continuing in 221. So it is crucial, as Mr Mundell well knows, that the UK Government provides a clear statement on future funding of all CAP Pillar 2 schemes so that plans can be progressed for those schemes in 221, including ELFAS, and we will continue to press the Government for the clarity that is required. I have delivered for our hill farmers. I will continue to deliver. As long as I'm around, this is a priority for me. I've made that crystal clear on every occasion, and I'm very grateful to Mr Mundell for allowing me the opportunity to reaffirm that today.
Oliver.
Well, I'd simply say to the Cabinet Secretary, show us the money and make the commitment. We've heard a lot of words there, but I'm looking for a simple yes or no. Are you backing the NFU's calls today? They've said that this is an urgent priority, that farmers are looking for clarity in the short to medium term, and they're looking for it from you, from your government, from you today. Is it a yes or a no?
Well, I haven't seen this document to which it refers, and therefore I don't comment on things which I haven't seen. But I've been working with the NFUS. Well, just if I could please answer without being barracked again by Mr Mundell, as I was last meeting.
Hold on, Cabinet Secretary, with the greatest will in the world, I will try and keep this meeting in order, if you don't mind. And I don't appreciate those comments. I try very hard to make sure everyone gets their answers heard. So, Cabinet Secretary, if you'd like to answer Mr Mundell, and I'll give him a chance to come back. Cabinet Secretary.
Okay. Thank you, Convener. As I was saying, I haven't seen this particular document, so I'm not going to refer to it. But what I can say is that I work very closely with the senior elected representatives and the staff at the NFUS. I totally share the desire to support our hill farmers. I'm delighted that we have succeeded in maintaining ELFAS when other parts of the UK abandoned it 8-9 years ago, and I fully intend to continue to do that. But I cannot give the unqualified commitment that Mr Mundell thinks I can give, because we haven't had the confirmation from the UK Government that the funding will be available. And therefore, it is simply in the real world, Mr Mundell, in government, not possible to do what you're doing. However, as soon as I get that confirmation from the UK Government, I will then be able, I think, to provide total clarity. And I've made it crystal clear that I fully intend to support our hill farmers going forward in Scotland. It's an absolute priority.
Okay, I think I've allowed that to go as far as I can do it with the time constraints that we have. I'm sorry, Oliver, I know you wanted to come back. I'm sure you'll find time to do that in another place with the Cabinet Secretary. So the next question is from John Finney. John.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, the situation in the EU is rapidly evolving. Are you confident the Scottish Government will have the funding it needs to continue current agricultural and rural development schemes in 2021? And what's the situation beyond 2021, please?
I'm reasonably hopeful that we will continue to receive the funding. As I've said, Convener, there's a difference between casual statements made in the press and in the course of elections, and financial commitments that are those received from the UK Treasury, and in government one must counter that. But let's assume that the funding will continue. Then, of course, I'm determined to continue to see that the funding is disbursed efficiently and effectively to support activity in the rural economy, both in the hill farming areas, but also the other areas as well, because all of the farming communities in Scotland are important, and perhaps we don't tend to hear about areas such as arable, potatoes, the pig meat sector. They're all part of a tapestry of a complex farming sector, all of which are playing a very valuable part, and I do think that the public appreciate that valuable role that farming plays.
Thank you. John, do you want to come back
Thank
on that?
you. No, I'm grand, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, John. The next questions are from Mike Rumbles, who's been waiting very patiently. Mike.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Could you tell me, please, how does the proposal to reserve state aid as part of the UK government's internal market bill affect the Scottish government's ability to determine what type of support can be provided for the Scottish rural economy from the end of the year when the transition period ends?
Well, that's a very general question, and I wouldn't profess expertise in the somewhat arcane world of state aid. As soon as you mention state aid, there's usually a pause whilst one reflects on it. But generally speaking, I do feel that this internal market bill is extremely problematic. Mr. Russell has set out the Scottish Government's response. And I do think it would be far better if we could deal with these matters here in Scotland. I don't know if Mr. Rumble's convener has got a specific area in relation to the budgetary aspects which he wants to probe about that. And I may bring in officials to assist me with the answer if it's a technical question that he's really intent on pursuing.
What I'm trying to say is, I mean, with our exit from the EU, it was quite clear, agriculture particularly, was completely devolved to the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. And with the bill, of the Internal Market Bill from the House of Commons, the UK Government wants to reserve state aid, and therefore surely the budget that the Cabinet Secretary has, is it going to be constrained even more by the Internal Market Bill as it goes through the House of Commons? Is his ability to assist everybody in the rural economy going to be limited by this bill?
I think that, the state aid applies in determining the maximum amount of financial aid that can be provided to businesses out with the envelope of the CAP. The CAP payments made, Pillar 1, for example, state aid doesn't apply. Out with it, it does apply as I understand it, and that's the current rule. But maybe I could get a bit of help from officials. I'm not sure if we have officials here who are actually working on a day-to-day basis in state aid, nor am I sure which of the 4 officials I can see on my screen are volunteering to answer this question, if any. Or if not, convener, maybe I don't know if...
I'm not seeing
Jonathan
anyone volunteering, Cabinet Secretary. You may have to volunteer somebody yourself.
Katrina.
Katrina.
Mr. Yeah, thank you, convener. I am clearly not an expert in this matter, but my understanding is that the bill reserves state aid to the UK government, and that may raise some concerns about how that is delivered and how Scottish ministers may be consulted on the design of an establishment of any future regime. So any UK-led subsidy framework would need to be really given serious consideration about how it meets the needs of Scotland. in terms of the level and types of financial interventions for our public sector. So I think that there is a risk that the bill could cut across our ability to design a future agricultural subsidy regime that works for Scotland, particularly where our priorities might diverge from the rest of the UK. And it's something that I know the officials who are leading on this work are in close discussions with colleagues in the UK government and are putting forward both our priorities and also the risks that this could face for Scotland.
Okay, Mike, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, you might imagine what I'm trying to get at is, I've been very interested in the new system that is being discussed by the group post-2024. And my concern is if the group comes out with recommendations to help, it could be classified as state aid. And therefore, if the plans that the group are working on could actually be overruled by the UK government. Am I understanding this correctly?
Cabinet Secretary, I think that's back to you.
If I could answer that, I mean, I think Mr. Rumbles has raised an interesting point. It's not one that I've looked at closely, but I think in response to the fact that he has raised it today, I will ask the Farming and Food Production Financial Support Advisory Group to consider this expressly. The question really is, would this state aid regime set up by the UK government post-Brexit interfere with the powers that we have under devolution to formulate our own policies on appropriate agricultural and rural support? Would we be constrained in any way, and if so, how? And what role will we have, and what role will the Scottish Parliament have in making sure that no such constraint would impede the desire to produce a sustainable and practical and successful set of financial support policies? So I think now that I understand better Mr. Rumble's question, I think it's a very apt one, and I will, as I say, because he's raised it today, convener, take this up and ask the Farming and Food Support Group to consider this, to get with the backup of Scottish Government officials in the State Aid Department, who will obviously be better able than other officials to provide good technical advice.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That's very helpful.
And thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I'm sure the committee will look forward to receiving that information in due course when it's available. I think that brings us to the end of our evidence session with you, Cabinet Secretary. So I would like to thank you and your team for attending the meeting this morning. And I'd like to now move on to agenda item 3, which is a European Union Withdrawal Act. This is a consent notification in relation to one UK SI as detailed on the agenda. The instrument is being laid in the UK Parliament in relation to the European Withdrawal Act 2018. Are there any comments from the committee on this? I'm not seeing any comments in the room, and John Finney would like to make a comment, I think. John.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, it's not to make any objection, but rather to say, and forgive me, I can't find it on the papers on this machine at the moment, but I know the phrase, there is no non-EU equivalent to STECF. I think that's something that given the important role that's played, it's something that the committee should monitor going forward, please.
Okay. Thank you, John, for raising that. Does anyone else? I'll come to that in a minute, if I may, John, as a potential solution. Does anyone else have any thing? Well, can I say that also within the papers there were some questions that were raised, and it seems apposite that, as John has raised another one, that we perhaps consider when we come to that, adding that to the list of questions we'd like to raise. So can I ask, first of all, does the committee agree to write to the Scottish Government to confirm its content for consent to the UK SI be given? We seem to be agreed. And can I suggest that we write with the list of questions that were posed in the paper, adding on the one that John Finney has raised to the government and seek responses on that? I think we're all agreed. So thank you very much. We're now going to move into private session. So I close this part of the meeting.